The day was bleeding out over Dust Creek. It was not a gentle death. The sun fell behind the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, leaving a raw, red wound across the sky that matched the color of the land. Wind was the only thing that truly lived here. In the Arizona Territory of 1875, it came off the high desert without manners, carrying grit that stung the skin and painted every surface with a fine layer of red dust. It was a wind that dried a woman's hands to cracking leather and soured the milk in the pail if you left it sitting for even 10 minutes. The town itself was just one long, rutted street, a collection of sun-warped wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth, though warmth was the one thing they had too much of. The saloon, the thirsty devil, was already loud, spilling yellow light and the tinny clang of a poorly played piano into the twilight. Laughter, sharp and desperate, cut through the constant whine of the wind. Further out, beyond the last struggling homestead, the mountains of the Apache sat in shadow. They were not mountains, not really. They were a threat, a dark, jagged promise of everything the people in Dust Creek feared. They were a wall that held back the world, or perhaps held them captive. Clara Hayes stood on the porch of the small ranch house her father had built and was now drinking away. She was 20 years old. Her hands were raw from lye soap and rope burn. She had been mending a harness strap, her fingers working the thick leather and waxed thread with a practiced, weary strength. She pushed a strand of sweat-dampened hair from her face, leaving a small smudge of red dust on her brow. Her eyes, the color of a mild sky before a storm, looked out over the dying land. There was a stillness to her, a deep-rooted patience that had been mistaken by the town gossips for simple-mindedness. They called her Clara the Pious, that untouched Hayes girl. She was dutiful, she was quiet, and she went to the whitewashed church every Sunday without fail. But what they saw as piety was a core of stubborn strength. What they called untouched was a fierce, guarded privacy. She had been running this ranch in all but name for nearly 3 years, ever since her mother had succumbed to the fever and her father, Eli, had succumbed to the bottle. She worked from 4 in the morning until she could no longer see her hands in front of her face, fighting a losing battle against drought, disease, and despair. She could hear the thirsty devil from here. She knew her father was inside. Eli Hayes was a man made of apologies and whiskey. He was probably at that back table right now, his hat tipped over his eyes, his voice thick with false promises. And Mr. Carter would be with him. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the smell of stale beer. Eli Hayes did indeed sit at the back table, his hands shaking as he lifted a glass. Across from him sat a man who never seemed to sweat. Banker Carter was all crisp lines, from his starched collar to the neat part in his graying hair. He checked his pocket watch. "The note is due. Eli," Carter said, his voice quiet but carrying over the saloon's noise like a razor. 3 months past due, to be precise. I know, Eli slurred, wiping his mouth. "The drought, and the sickness in the herd. I just need more time. A few more months." "Time is the one thing the bank has run out of," Carter said smoothly. He leaned forward. "You have lost 30% of your stock. The land is bone dry. Your collateral is drying up and blowing away." He tapped a stack of papers on the table. "I will have to begin foreclosure proceedings on Monday." Eli's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a drinker's sudden, shallow panic. "Monday, no, you cannot. Clara, my daughter, this is her home." "It is the bank's property," Carter corrected him gently. "Or it will be." At the bar, a group of freighters, their faces layered with grime, were telling stories to scare the new telegraph operator. "You think the heat is bad?" One man, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, said, "You wait till you meet the Ghost Rider." The operator, a pale young man from back east, wiped his glasses. "Ghost Rider." "Taji Nez," the freighter whispered, and the name seemed to thin the smoke around them. "The Apache. Rides a war horse painted in blood. They say he cannot be killed." "I heard," another man chimed in. "He took on a whole cavalry patrol. 10 men, took them down by himself with just a knife and that devil horse of his. Left them for the vultures. The one man who lived went insane. Just sits and rocks and says, 'The horse, the horse.'" "He is not a man," the first freighter insisted. "He is a spirit, a vengeful one. He hates us. He hates this town, this railroad, all of it." The consensus was simple, spoken by every man at the bar, in the general store, in the church itself. When it came to Tajinez, no one dared approach. A sudden shout from the street cut through the saloon's fog. It was not a drunken yell. It was the sharp, high sound of real fear. "Apache's God Almighty. They are on the street." The piano playing stopped with a jarring chord. Men scrambled for their rifles, knocking over chairs. Eli Hayes sobered instantly, his face turning the color of ash. Carter, annoyed by the interruption, stood up. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. People poured out of the mercantile, the blacksmith's forge, the doors of the Thirsty Devil. They lined the street, rifles half raised, squinting into the bloody sunset. At the far end of the street, where the town gave way to open desert, a small group of riders sat on their horses. They were Apaches, perhaps 5 of them. They sat perfectly still, dark silhouettes against the dying light. Leading them was a man on a horse that looked as if it had been dipped in drying blood. "It is him," someone whispered, the words catching in a dry throat. "It is Tajinez." Panic rippled through the crowd. Women grabbed their children. "What do they want?" a man shouted. "Are they attacking?" Tajinez urged his horse forward a few steps. He raised one hand, empty. He was not dressed for war. He wore simple buckskins, his black hair held back by a band. He was leaner than the stories told, but the stillness of him, the sheer, coiled presence, was more terrifying than any war paint. He reached behind him and lifted something small, a child, a little boy, no more than 6 years old, with blonde hair matted with dirt. It was Jetty Miller, the blacksmith's son, missing for 2 days. A woman screamed, "My boy, they have my boy!" Tajinez nudged his horse forward again. The child looked dazed, but unharmed. He stopped a good 20 yards from the line of armed townsfolk. He carefully lowered the boy to the ground. He gave the child a small, gentle push toward the town. "Go," he said. The word was clear in the sudden, vast silence. The boy, Jetty, stumbled for a moment and then ran, weeping, toward his mother, who rushed out to scoop him up. From her porch, Clara Hayes had seen it all. She had not moved, her hand still gripping the half-mended harness. She watched the fear curdle into confusion, and then, impossibly, into rage. "Devil!" shouted a man from the saloon doorway, emboldened now that the child was safe. "What did you do to him? You savage! Get out of here, you murdering filth!" another yelled. The Apaches did not move. Tajinez sat on his horse, his face impassive as the curses washed over him. He had returned their lost child. They answered him with guns and hate. His gaze swept the line of faces, cold and measuring. He saw the men gripping their rifles, the women pulling their children back, the fear that was so close to violence. And then, his eyes moved past them, up the slight rise to the small ranch house on the edge of town. He saw Clara. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse. It was not a long look. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, but Clara felt it like a physical touch. She saw a man, not a monster. She saw an exhaustion in his eyes that went clear to the bone, a profound and terrible patience. She saw a man who was hated for breathing. Tajinez gathered his reins. He did not speak again. He turned his red horse in a fluid motion, and the small group of riders moved away, melting back into the shadows they had come from. They did not rush. They simply vanished, becoming one with the twilight and the looming mountains. Clara let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the leather strap. The man in the stories was a bloodthirsty ghost. The man she had just seen had returned a child. The people of her town, the good, church-going people, had met that kindness with loaded guns. The world felt, for a moment, as if it had been knocked loose from its foundations. Later that night, long after the moon had risen high and cold, Clara lay in her small cot, but she could not sleep. The house was still, save for the skittering of a mouse in the wall. Then she heard voices from the front room. Her father was back, and he had brought Carter with him. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cool plank floor. She stood in the darkness of the hall, just outside the sliver of lamplight from the parlor. "Cannot just take it, Carter," her father was pleading. His voice was no longer drunk, but thin with desperation. "I am not just taking it, Eli." Carter's calm voice replied, "I am foreclosing on a defaulted loan, but there is another matter, a much larger matter." "What matter?" "The railroad," Carter said. "The Transcontinental wants a southern spur, and the Army is mapping the territory. They have surveyors out right now." "What does that have to do with me? My land is not in their way." "No," Carter agreed. "But the proposed route goes straight through the Apache Valley. The Army, Colonel Briggs in particular, is very keen to clear the area, permanently." "Clear it, you mean a war?" Clara heard her father's chair scrape as he stood up. "It means progress, Eli, but Briggs cannot just ride in and start shooting. He needs a reason. He needs the Apaches to be seen as a threat." "They are a threat," Eli hissed. That Taji Nez, he was in town today." "He returned the Miller boy," Carter said, a dismissive wave in his voice. "That is hardly an act of war. It is inconvenient. The town is on edge. They fear the Apache. Yes, but they also fear starvation. They fear the Army. They are caught in the middle. And so, my friend, are you?" Clara leaned her head against the rough wood of the doorway. She heard the clink of a bottle as Carter poured 2 glasses. "There is pressure, Eli," Carter continued, his voice softer now, almost friendly. "Pressure on me to collect debts. Pressure on the Army to clear the land. This entire valley is a powder keg. And you are a man with nothing. Nothing but a worthless ranch and a daughter." Clara's blood went cold. She heard her father say nothing. There was only the sound of the wind, rattling the window frame, sounding like a high, lonely cry in the dark. The night's conversation left a cold stone in Clara's stomach. She rose at 4, as she always did. But the world felt different, fragile. The talk of railroads and Army clearing operations was a distant thunder, a problem for powerful men in uniforms and clean suits. Her problem was immediate, written on the land in front of her. The drought had tightened its grip. The creek that gave the town its name was now just a ribbon of damp sand. The earth of the ranch, once good for grazing, had cracked open in patterns that looked like old, dry skin. And then came the sickness. It had started 2 weeks prior, a coughing, a weakness in the knees. Now, it was a plague. She walked past the north pasture, the place her mother had loved, and the smell of death was heavy in the still morning air. 3 more cows were down, their bodies already bloating under the merciless sun. Vultures circled high overhead, patient. She counted them. 7. She had lost nearly a third of the herd, the only thing of value they had left. She spent the morning dragging the one remaining bucket of water from the near-dry well to the calves that were too weak to stand, her hands bleeding from the rope. The land was not just dying. It was actively trying to kill what little remained. This was her home, this collection of dust and bones, and she felt a desperate, futile love for it. Just before noon, 2 riders approached. She did not recognize the horses at first. One was a fine bay, too clean for this part of the territory. The other was a standard Army mount, strong and well-groomed. Banker Carter dismounted with his usual neat precision. The other man, however, swung himself out of the saddle with an abrupt, rattling energy. He was tall, wearing a dark blue cavalry coat despite the heat, his buttons polished to a blinding shine. His face was sharp, clean-shaven, and his eyes were the color of a pale, cold sky. He wore his authority like the coat, a heavy, uncomfortable garment. "Miss Hayes," Carter said, tipping his hat. "This is Colonel Briggs. He is overseeing the security of this territory." "Colonel," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. She did not offer her hand. She had seen him in town, always surrounded by soldiers, never smiling. "Miss," he acknowledged. His voice clipped. He glanced at the dead cow nearest the barn, his lip curling in distaste. A poor morning for ranching, it seems. Eli Hayes emerged from the house, his hair uncombed, his eyes bloodshot. He had heard the horses. "Mr. Carter, Colonel, what can I do for you?" "You can pay your debt, Eli," Carter said, pulling the familiar stack of papers from his coat pocket. "The bank's patience has expired." "I told you," Eli stammered. "I need more time. The sickness—" "The bank is not interested in veterinary excuses," Carter said. "You have 1 week." "1 week," Eli's voice cracked. "That is impossible. You know it is." Colonel Briggs stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. "Mr. Hayes, your personal finances are your own concern. My concern is the United States government and the expansion of this great nation, your land. This failing enterprise sits on the edge of contested territory." "It is my land," Eli said, with a flicker of his old pride. "It is the bank's land," Carter corrected him. "And in 1 week, it will be for sale." Briggs looked past Eli, past Carter, to the dark line of the mountains in the east. "We need this territory secured. We cannot have complications. A foreclosed ranch is a clean-cut matter. A defaulting debtor is a messy one. I am here to ensure Mr. Carter's business proceeds without incident." Clara finally spoke, her voice low but clear, carrying in the dry air. "You are throwing us out." Carter looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The note is due, Miss Hayes. 1 week, or the land is seized. All of it." They turned and mounted their horses. Briggs gave the house, the barn, and Clara one last dismissive look. 1 week, he repeated. They rode off, leaving the two of them in a cloud of red dust. Clara sank onto the porch step. 1 week. This was the only home she had ever known. Her mother was buried under the lone cottonwood tree by the dry creek bed. Every board of this house, every fence post, was tied to a memory. The thought of leaving it, of being turned out with nothing, was a physical pain, a hollowness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Eli stood there for a long time, his shoulders slumped. He looked at the dead cow, then at his daughter's bent head. He did not go to her. He did not offer comfort. He turned, his face a mask of shame, and walked back into the house. A moment later, Clara heard the unmistakable sound of a cork being pulled from a bottle. That evening, the thirsty devil was more crowded than usual. Colonel Briggs stood at the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand, addressing the room. His voice was loud, meant to be heard by every man present. "Gentlemen, I will not lie to you," he boomed. "This territory is on the brink. You have lived in fear of the Apache for too long. You have huddled in your homes, afraid to work your own land, while savages ride in and out as they please." "They brought the Miller boy back," someone shouted from a corner. Briggs's fist hit the bar. "They returned one boy. Yes, after who knows what heathen rituals they performed on him. Do not be fooled by one theatrical gesture. This is a tactic. They are testing our resolve. And behind them, in that sacred valley of theirs, they are planning to wipe Dust Creek off the map." A murmur of fear went through the crowd. "The railroad is coming," Briggs continued. his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. Progress is coming. It will bring jobs. It will bring money. It will bring security. But it cannot be built on land controlled by hostiles. I have been given a mandate to clear that valley, to make this land safe for decent, God-fearing folk like you. I intend to do it, with or without your support. That means war, said the blacksmith, his face pale. That means peace. Briggs countered. A permanent peace. The only kind they understand. We will push them out, and this town will finally be free to prosper. Some men cheered, raising their glasses. Others, the ones with small homesteads bordering the territory, looked into their drinks, their face tight with fear. They knew who would pay the price in blood if a war started. In the back corner, away from the light, Carter sat with Eli Hayes. He had been feeding the man whiskey for an hour, his voice a soft, sympathetic murmur. He is right. You know, Carter said, sliding another glass across the table. Briggs is a brute, but he is not wrong. A war is coming, Eli, and this town, your ranch, it will be the first to burn. What can I do? Eli whispered. He was drunk, his fear magnified by the alcohol. I will lose it all. Clara will have nothing. Carter leaned in closer. Perhaps not. I was thinking about your predicament, about the town's predicament. He paused, as if considering his words. You heard the rumor that has been going around, the one my clerk overheard from a freighter. What rumor? That the Apaches want peace, but they want a gesture of trust, a sign. Eli looked confused. What sign? Briggs, of course, is twisting it, Carter said, waving a dismissive hand. He is telling everyone the Apache are demanding a white woman in exchange for not attacking. A barbaric, ridiculous idea, of course. Of course, Eli repeated, his eyes fixed on Carter. But, Carter continued, his voice barely a whisper, what if it were not a demand? What if it were a gift, an offering, a bridge between two peoples? Eli stared at him, comprehension dawning slowly in his fogged mind. What are you saying? I am saying, Carter said, that you are a man with a unique asset, a daughter, a respectable, untouched girl, a girl of 20. Eli's hand clenched around his glass. Clara, you are talking about my Clara! His voice was hoarse with sudden, sober outrage. Think, Eli, do not be a fool. You are going to lose her anyway. You will both be turned out on the road in 1 week. She will end up working in a place like this. Or worse, what if, instead, you could save her, save your land, save this whole town? Save her by giving her to him, to that ghost rider. The name came out as a strangled gasp. Taji Nez, Carter said, the name sounding strange and smooth on his tongue. He is their leader. A marriage, Eli, a bride of peace. It is an old tradition. It would be a bond. It would stop Briggs. It would stop the war. It would make you a hero. And, as the father of the woman who saved this territory, the bank would be very understanding. Your debt would be forgotten. Eli tried to stand, his chair scraping violently. You are a monster. You are talking about my daughter, my child. I am talking about survival, Carter said, his voice hard now. Look around you. This is the world we live in. Hard choices are all that is left. Go home. Eli, think about it. 1 week, or this, a way out for everyone. Eli stumbled out of the saloon, the cool night air hitting him like a slap. He walked, unsteady, back to the ranch. When he got there, he saw a light still on in the kitchen. He looked through the window. Clara was at the table, a worn leather-bound ledger open in front of her. She was writing, her brow furrowed, trying to find a way, any way, to make the numbers add up. She looked up, as if she felt his gaze, but she could not see him in the dark. He watched his daughter, the last good thing in his life. He saw her strength, her decency, her innocence, and the terrible, rotten seed Carter had planted began to take root in his weak, whiskey-soaked soul. He was a coward. He was a failure. And here was a way to wipe the slate clean, to be a savior. All it would cost was the one person he was supposed to protect. He turned away from the window, his heart a cold, heavy stone. The rumor spread through Dust Creek like a brush fire. It was on every tongue. The Apache want a girl. Briggs' men fanned the flames, twisting the Apache's supposed desire for peace talks into a barbaric demand. They want a white bride, or they will burn us all. Fear turned to panic. Panic turned to ugly, desperate speculation. 3 days later, a town meeting was called. It was held in the church, the only building large enough to hold everyone. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap perfume, and raw fear. The pews were packed. Men stood along the walls, their rifles in their hands. Colonel Briggs stood at the pulpit, his blue coat a stark, authoritarian presence against the simple wooden cross. "The situation is dire," he announced. "The savages have made their demand. They believe we are weak. They believe they can extort us, threaten our women." "What do we do?" a woman cried out from the back. "We fight," one of the freighters yelled. "We will be slaughtered," the blacksmith retorted. "My boy. They had my boy. They could have killed him. Maybe they just want to talk." "Talk," Briggs scoffed. "You do not talk with rabid dogs. You put them down." The room exploded in shouts. Carter, sitting in the front pew, watched it all, his face calm. He was waiting. Then LaHaye stood up. He was sober, shockingly sober. He wore his threadbare Sunday suit. His hands were shaking, but his voice was loud, carrying a strange, false ring of martyrdom. "My friends, my neighbors," he began. The room quieted, surprised to see him standing, to hear him speak. "We are all afraid. I am a poor man. You all know that. I am about to lose my home. I have nothing left to give." He paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He looked toward the back, where Clara was standing near the door. Her hands clasped in front of her, she had come to hear, to know her fate. "I have nothing," Eli repeated, "except my daughter." A gasp went through the room. Clara's stomach tightened. "Colonel Briggs speaks of war," Eli continued, his eyes finding Carter's. Carter gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The blacksmith speaks of talk. The Apache are a proud people. We have taken their land. We have wronged them. They ask for a sign, a bond, to stop the bloodshed." He turned and pointed a shaking finger at his own daughter. "Here is my sign. Here is my sacrifice for this town." Clara froze. The air left her lungs. I will give my daughter, Clara Hayes, to their leader, as a bride of peace." Dead silence. The only sound was a baby crying, quickly muffled. Every eye in the building, hundreds of eyes, turned from Eli to Clara. They stared at her, their expressions a horrible mix of pity, revulsion, and worst of all, relief. Eli would not look at her. He stared at the wooden cross, his face pale and slick with sweat. A man crucifying his own child. "I will give her," he said again, his voice cracking, "to clear my debt, to save this town. She is a good girl, pious, still untouched." Clara stood perfectly still, pinned by their gazes. She felt the blood drain from her face, the words untouched, give, debt. Bride swirled around her, sharp and meaningless. The faces of her neighbors blurred. The close, hot air of the church began to hum, a high, thin sound that filled her ears, blocking out all other sound, as the floor seemed to fall away beneath her feet. The 2 days that followed the town meeting were a waking nightmare for Clara. She moved through her chores in a thick, suffocating fog. The world had lost its sharp edges. The heat, the dust, The sting of the lye soap on her raw hands, it all seemed to be happening to someone else. Someone far away. Her father, Eli, could not meet her eyes. He spent the 2 days in a state of agitated, false brightness, mending things that were not broken and polishing tack that was already clean. He spoke to her of the good she was doing, of the sacrifice, of how the town would remember her as a savior. His words were hollow, the speech of a man trying to convince himself. Clara did not answer him. There was nothing to say. He had sold her. He had taken her life, her body, her future, and traded it for a piece of dry land and the forgiveness of a debt. The word father had become a bitter, alien sound in her mind. The town, meanwhile, waited. A sick, tense anticipation settled over Dust Creek, heavier than the heat. Women would see Clara when she went to the well. The ranch well was completely dry now, forcing her into town, and they would stop talking. They would look at her with a terrible, morbid pity, some even crossing themselves as if she were already dead. Mrs. Miller, the blacksmith's wife, had tried to press a small apple pie into her hands, her eyes brimming with tears. Clara had refused it. She would not accept their condolences. Their pity was just the other side of their relief. On the third morning, the sun rose with a vengeful, white-hot intensity. The sky was a blank, pale sheet, and the air was perfectly still, holding its breath. This was the day. A message had been sent, a time agreed upon. The parley was set for noon. By 11 o'clock, the town was a fortress. The street was empty, but every window and rooftop held a hidden shape. Men with rifles watched the shimmering horizon. The thirsty devil was silent for the first time Clara could remember. The only sound was the frantic buzzing of flies and the pounding of her own heart, which felt too large for her chest. Eli came to her room. She was sitting on her cot, her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing her mother's best dress. It was a pale blue calico, washed so many times it was soft as a worn-out sheet. Her mother had worn it to socials, her face flushed with laughter. Now, it felt like a shroud. "It is time, Clara," Eli said, his voice a dry croak. She stood without a word. Her legs felt like wood, stiff and unresponsive. She followed him out of the small house, past the barn with its smell of hay and death, and onto the main street. They appeared at the end of the street exactly as the sun reached its peak. 5 of them, just as before, dark shapes materializing from the white-hot shimmer. They sat on their horses, still as the mountains behind them. At their head was Tazinez, his red horse unmoving, a figure of painted legend. In the center of the square, Colonel Briggs waited, flanked by Banker Carter and a nervous, sweating man named Pete, who served as a translator when the army needed one. "Bring her forward, Eli," Briggs called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. Eli's hand was on her arm, his fingers digging in. He walked her to the center of the street, halfway between the line of hidden rifles and the silent Apache riders. Then he let go and stepped back, leaving her to stand alone in the terrible, open space. The heat was brutal. She could feel sweat trickling down her back, plastering the thin calico to her skin. She stared at the dust, unable to look up. "They are here," Briggs shouted, turning to the hidden town. "They are here to make their barbaric demands." He nodded to the translator. "Pete, tell them their leader has requested this meeting. Ask them what they want." Pete, his hands visibly shaking, called out in a string of halting Apache. Tazinez watched him, his face impassive. When the man was finished, Taji spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air, deep and resonant. He spoke in his own language. It was a short, clipped speech. Pete listened, his face growing paler. He turned back to Briggs. He says he is not here for demands. Colonel, he says he is here to talk about the boundary. He says his people will not cross the dry creek. He asks that your surveyors do not cross into the mountains. He wants a line drawn, a promise." Clara looked up, her heart giving a strange, painful jump. A promise, a boundary. He was not demanding. Briggs let out a short, barking laugh. "A promise he is lying." He turned his back on the Apaches, facing the town. "You hear that the savage wants to talk. He wants to lull us into a false sense of security." He strode over to Pete and gripped the man's shoulder. "You are mistaken. Pete, you misheard him. Is it not true they sent a message demanding a sign of trust? Is it not true they asked for a white woman?" Pete looked terrified. He glanced from Briggs's cold eyes to the unmoving figure of Taji Nez. "Sir, he did not say—" "Tell them," Briggs roared, his face turning purple. "Tell the town what they are demanding. They want this girl. Do they not? They want a price for peace." Yes," Pete stammered, his will breaking. They want a sign. A girl." "Just as I told you," Briggs bellowed to the windows. "They will not leave this valley unless they get what they want. They want a white woman for their pleasure, or they will burn this town to the ground." A low, angry murmur rose from the hidden watchers. On cue, Briggs gestured to Clara. "Your father, in his wisdom, has offered a sacrifice to save you all. He has offered his own daughter." The whispers began then, audible in the tense air. Clara heard them, a hiss of sound from the windows and doorways around her. "God have mercy. Look at her. That blue dress, her mother's. It is a sin. Poor thing. And she is, still untouched, pious. Wasting such a pure girl on a heathen? Better her than us." The words hit her, each one a small, sharp stone. They were not talking about her, Clara Hayes. They were talking about a thing, an object, a sacrifice, pure and untouched, to be fed to the monster. She stood there, trembling, her vision blurring with the heat and the terror. Here she was, at 20 years old. She was given still untouched to an Apache no one dared approach. The entire town, hidden behind their rifles, held its breath, waiting for the inevitable savagery. They were waiting for him to grab her, to throw her over his horse, to treat her like the spoils of war they believed her to be. Taji Nez looked at Briggs, and his expression was one of such profound, cold contempt that even the colonel took an involuntary step back. He looked at Eli Hayes, who was hiding behind Carter, and his gaze was even colder. Then he looked at Clara. He saw the white, chalky face. He saw the terror in her wide eyes, the way her hands were clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles were white. He saw the faded blue dress that was clearly not a dress for this land, a dress for a softer, kinder world. He nudged his red horse forward, one slow step at a time. The crowd tensed. The sound of a dozen rifle hammers being pulled back clicked in the silence. He stopped his horse 10 feet from her, and then, in a move that shocked everyone, he dismounted. He swung his leg over the horse's back and stood on the ground, in the open. He was tall, leaner than she had realized, all muscle and bone, the smell of the high desert, of smoke, horse, and something wild and clean, reached her. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent in the dust. He stopped just beyond arm's length. He did not look at Briggs or her father. He looked only at her. For a long, agonizing moment, he just looked. His eyes, she saw now, were not black. They were a dark, deep brown, the color of wet earth in shade. She had expected to see a blaze of lust, of the savagery the townspeople whispered about. She saw none. She saw a coiled, iron-willed restraint. She saw an exhaustion that seemed as old as the mountains. And beneath it all, buried so deep she almost missed it, she saw a profound and terrible sadness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant for her alone, but it carried in the dead stillness. His English was slow, guttural, each word carved out of stone. "I accept. The town let out a collective sigh. Eli Hayes looked faint with relief. Briggs smiled, a thin, cruel smile. He had won. But Taji was not finished. He raised his chin slightly, his voice lifting just enough to carry to the hidden windows. I accept protection. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping the rooftops. She is of my people now. No one. He looked directly at Colonel Briggs. Touches her. He looked back at Clara. If she does not wish it. A new silence fell, a silence of pure, stunned confusion. This was not the script. The monster had not read his lines. He had spoken of protection. He had spoken of her wishes. A woman's wishes. An Apache speaking of such a thing. Clara stared at him, her terror momentarily eclipsed by sheer disbelief. He had not grabbed her. He had not threatened her. He had, in his own way, offered a strange, incomprehensible kind of sanctuary. Mrs. Miller, the blacksmith's wife, stepped out onto the porch of the general store, her hand over her mouth. The blacksmith himself, inside his forge, lowered the barrel of his rifle. They had come to see a sacrifice, a brutal spectacle, and the savage was behaving with a dignity that shamed every decent man in the square. Colonel Briggs's face darkened, his triumph souring. This was not how it was meant to go. He had wanted a clear provocation. He had wanted the Apache to seize the girl, to give him the excuse he needed to open fire and begin his war. "It is a trick," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "A savage's lie. He means to defile her. He is toying with you all." Taji Nez ignored him as if he were a buzzing fly. He turned and gave a sharp, single command in his own language. One of his warriors led a horse forward. It was a spotted mare, smaller than the war horses, with a gentle eye. He looked at Clara. He did not touch her. He did not command her. He simply gestured to the horse. It was not a choice. Not really, the rifles were still there. Her father's betrayal was still fresh, but he was presenting it to her as one. She took a shaky breath. The fog in her mind cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She was going. This was happening. She lifted the hem of her mother's thin dress, raised her foot, and caught the stirrup. Her body felt heavy, a dead weight. She pulled herself into the saddle, her movements clumsy. She sat high on the mare, looking down at the town that had just sold her. She saw her father. Eli had finally broken. He was leaning against the wall of the saloon, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. He was crying. She knew with a sudden, cold certainty. Not for her, but for his own damned soul. She saw Banker Carter, who was watching the transaction with a cool, detached interest, as if observing the sale of the livestock. And she saw the faces in the windows. The people of Dust Creek, her neighbors, their eyes were full of pity. But beneath the pity, naked and ugly, was their own selfish, desperate relief. They were safe. Their homes would not burn. Their children would not be taken. All it had cost was her. Taji mounted his red horse in one fluid, powerful motion. He took the reins of her mare, his knuckles brushing her hand for a brief, electric moment. He did not look back at the town. He turned his horse toward the mountains, toward the shadows that had always been a threat. The other warriors fell in around them, a silent, mounted guard. Clara Hayes rode out of Dust Creek. She did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the vast, unforgiving red desert. The sounds of the town faded behind her, swallowed by the rising whine of the wind and the steady, rhythmic fall of the horse's hooves. She was a payment for a debt, a bride of peace, given to a man whose name was a curse, and she had never felt so terrifyingly, completely, alone. The moment they cleared the last hovel of Dust Creek, the desert swallowed them. The town, with its straight street and false-fronted buildings, vanished as if it had never been, erased by a fold in the red earth. The only world that existed now was the one in front of her, a vast, sun-blasted expanse, under a cruel and indifferent sky. The wind was a constant, physical assault. It did not just blow, it scoured. It whipped Clara's hair from its pins, stinging her face with her own locks. It drove fine, sharp grains of sand into her eyes, her mouth, her clothes, the faded blue calico dress, her mother's best, was a fool's garment out here. It offered no protection. The sun beat down on her, a white-hot hammer, and the light reflecting off the sand was so bright she had to squint until her eyes ached. She rode the spotted mare, her hands gripping the saddle horn so tightly her fingers went numb. Taji Nez rode beside her, holding the mare's lead rope. He did not speak. He had not said a single word since his pronouncement in the square. He rode his red horse with an easy, fluid grace, a part of the animal, his body moving with its rhythm. He seemed as indifferent to the sun and wind as the stones they passed. The other 4 warriors formed a loose, protective diamond around them, 2 in front, 2 behind. They, too, were silent, their dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the ridges, the folds in the land. Clara's mind was a storm of its own. Every story she had ever heard about the Apache played in a horrifying loop. The stories from the thirsty devil, the whispers of women at the general store, torture, mutilation, a life of brutal slavery. They would strip her, mock her, use her until she was broken, and then leave her for the coyotes. The man beside her, this ghost rider, was the center of those stories. He was the one who left no survivors, the one who rode a horse painted in blood. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the mare's dusty mane. She would not look at him. She would not meet his gaze. To look at him was to acknowledge him, to make the nightmare more real. She focused on the ache in her back, the raw rubbing of the stirrup leathers against her ankles, the growing thirst that coated her tongue. She was a thing, a piece of property, a payment. She would endure what she must, but she would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. But the fear was there, a cold sickness in her belly, despite the heat. Every time his red horse shifted closer, she flinched, her muscles tensing for the blow, the hand that would grab her hair, the knife at her throat. It never came. They rode for hours. The sun crawled across the sky, a merciless white eye. The world was nothing but red rock and yellow grit and the endless whining shriek of the wind. They did not stop. Late in the afternoon, when the shadows of the mesas stretched like long, skeletal fingers, Taji raised his hand. The group stopped. They were in a shallow basin, ringed by low, crumbling rock formations that offered a slight break from the wind. "Dismount," he said. It was the first word he had spoken to her. The sound of his voice, still low and rough, startled her so much she nearly fell from the saddle. He was off his horse in an instant, but he did not move to help her. He stood and watched as she fumbled with her skirts, her legs stiff and trembling, and slid clumsily to the ground. Her knees buckled, and she had to catch herself on the saddle. The warriors set up a simple camp with practiced speed. They did not build a large, welcoming fire. They gathered dry, dead brush mesquite and greasewood and built a tiny, smokeless fire in a pit, shielded by rocks. It was a fire for warmth, not for comfort. One of them produced dried meat from a pouch and passed it around. Taji took a piece and held it out to her. Clara stared at the dark, stringy piece of jerky. Her stomach churned. She shook her head, pressing her lips together. He did not insist. He watched her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable in the gathering dusk, and then dropped his hand. He turned away and spoke to his men in their own language. The words were fast and guttural, a wall of sound she could not penetrate. One of the men glanced at her, his expression flat, and said something short. Taji replied with a single, sharp word, and the man did not look at her again. They gave her a thin wool blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat with her back against a flat rock. As far from the fire and the men as she dared, she was a prisoner. This was a prisoner's camp. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, making herself as small as possible. Night fell. It did not creep in. It plunged. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, and then a profound, star-filled black. The desert, which had been an oven, turned cold instantly. The thin blanket was useless against the sharp, penetrating chill. The tiny fire offered almost no heat. The wind was louder now, a lonely, mourning sound that scraped against the rocks. Clara shivered, her teeth chattering. The men seemed unaffected. They took turns keeping watch, 2 at a time, disappearing into the darkness. Taji sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, the firelight catching the hard planes of his face. He was not a ghost. He was a man of flesh and blood. And that, she realized, was far more terrifying. She must have dozed, a light, shivering sleep born of pure exhaustion. She was woken by a change in the wind. The steady, whining moan had risen to a high, frantic scream. The fire exploded in a shower of sparks and was instantly extinguished, plunging the camp into absolute, roaring darkness. "Ahan!" she heard Taji shout. The sand hit her like a solid wall. It was not dust. It was a blast of grit and pebbles that stung her face and scalp. The wind howled, a physical weight that threatened to tear her from the ground. She heard the horses scream, a high, terrified sound. She tried to stand, pulling the blanket over her head, and was immediately knocked to her knees. The world was chaos. She could see nothing. She could only hear the wind and the panic of the horses. A large shape loomed out of the swirling blackness. A tent pole, ripped from its mooring by the storm, was cartwheeling toward her. She saw it, a dark bar against the dark, and threw up her arms, a useless, small cry torn from her throat. She never felt the impact. A body slammed into her, not with violence, but with a desperate, focused force. An arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, lifting her from her feet. She was dragged, half-carried, stumbling, across the small clearing. She felt the solid shock of rock against her back as he pushed her into a shallow cleft between 2 large boulders. Before she could even gasp, he was in front of her, shielding her. He threw his own heavy deerskin cloak over both of them, creating a small, dark, roaring pocket of shelter. Clara was pressed against the unyielding stone, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would break, and Tazi was pressed against her. It was the first time they had truly touched. He was a wall of solid, living heat. His chest was hard against her shoulder, his thigh pressed against her hip, his arm still locked around her waist, holding her in place. The wind shrieked outside their small refuge, a mad, tearing sound. But in here, there was only the smell of leather, dust, and the undeniable, clean male scent of him. She was completely, terribly aware of him. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her arm. It was not fast. He was not afraid. She was trembling, a leaf in the storm. He was the rock. She was rigid with terror, waiting for the attack, for the violation that the stories promised. This was it. He had her trapped. He had her in the dark. But his hand did not move from her waist. It was not a lover's touch, nor was it a captor's. It was a brace. It was an anchor, holding her against the storm that was trying to rip her away. His body was a shield, taking the brunt of the wind, his head bent over hers to protect her face. They stayed that way for what felt like an eternity. 2 bodies, pressed together in the roaring darkness. A white woman, untouched, and the Apache savage. And in that moment, the only thing she felt from him was protection. The monster, the ghost rider, was using his own body to keep her from harm. The contradiction was so profound it left no room for any other thought. Slowly as it had risen, the wind began to die. The scream dropped to a howl, then a whine, then a mournful sigh. The air grew still, thick with the dust that had yet to settle. Taji did not move for a long time. Then He lifted the heavy cloak. Gray, pre-dawn light filtered into the camp. The world was transformed. The landscape was scoured, smooth, every track erased. The small camp was destroyed. Blankets, saddles, and packs were scattered, half buried in new drifts of sand. He moved away from her, and the sudden loss of his warmth left her shivering. Though the air was no longer cold, he stood and looked out over the camp, his face grim. The other warriors were emerging, digging out their gear. One of the horses was lame. He turned back to her. She was still huddled in the cleft of the rock, the thin wool blanket clutched around her. He walked to where his saddle pack lay, half buried, and pulled out a waterskin. He uncorked it and held it out to her. She stared at it, then at him. Her throat was a dry, cracked reed. She reached out with a trembling hand and took it. She lifted it to her lips and drank. The water was warm, metallic tasting, and utterly, blissfully wonderful. When she finished, she handed it back. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, and his skin was calloused and warm. He looked at her feet. The thin, useless town shoes she had been wearing were in tatters, her ankles rubbed raw. He pointed. "Your shoes, they are no good." He went to his own pack and pulled out 2 long strips of soft deer hide. He knelt in front of her. Clara recoiled, pulling her feet back. "No." He ignored her. He grabbed her ankle, his grip firm but not cruel. He quickly, efficiently, wrapped the soft leather around her ruined shoes, securing them, binding them to her feet in a way that would protect her ankles from the stirrups and the sand. When he was done, he looked up at her. He touched the edge of the thin scarf she had around her neck. "This is no good." He took his own neckerchief, a dark red cloth, and showed her how to fold it and tie it across her face, covering her nose and mouth to keep out the sand. He did it all without a word of comfort, without a single smile. His movements were practical, efficient, impersonal, and yet they were the first acts of genuine, practical care she had received from anyone in days. He was not treating her as a bride. He was not treating her as a prisoner. He was treating her as a survivor, an encumbrance that he needed to keep alive. That night, they camped again. The journey was slower, the lame horse holding them back. Clara sat by the small fire, the red cloth still tied around her neck. She watched him. He sat away from the others, staring up at the vast, cold sweep of the stars. She saw him, when he thought no one was watching, touch a small leather pouch at his neck. Later, when the camp was quiet, she heard him. He was whispering. It was not to his men. He was speaking, in a low, aching murmur, in his own language, to the empty sky. She heard 2 names, repeated over and over, like a prayer of grief. Ishanana, Tsodahi, names. She would learn later. That meant laughing sunlight and little bird, the names of his wife and his younger brother, both killed by blue-coated soldiers 5 years before. She pulled her blanket tighter, but the cold she felt was no longer from the wind. It was from the dawning, terrible understanding that the world was not as simple as monsters and men. The journey continued for 2 more days. The land changed. The flat, open desert gave way to a maze of twisting red rock canyons. They were in his territory now, and here, he and his men were different. They were not just crossing the land, they were a part of it. They moved with a silent, sure-footed confidence. They pointed out things she could not see a hawk circling miles away. The track of a mountain lion, a patch of green that signaled a hidden spring. They found water, seeping from a crack in a rock wall, where Clara had seen only barren stone. They passed small, hidden piles of rocks, markers that meant something to them. They were traveling in a world layered with meaning, a world she could not read. They were not savages. They were the masters of this land, a land that had nearly killed her, but that sustained them. And Tazinez, the ghost rider, was their king. He knew every stone, every shadow, every hidden source of life. He was leading her deeper into the heart of a world she had only ever feared, and which she was slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to understand. On the 4th day, The landscape changed again. Taji led them up a narrow, winding game trail that Clara would never have seen, a simple crack in a sheer rock wall. For an hour, they rode in single file, the canyon walls so close on either side that she could have touched both at once. The air grew cooler, damper. The sound of their horses' hooves, muffled by sand, was the only sound. Then the canyon opened. Clara gasped. Her hand went to her throat. She had expected a landscape of hovels, of filth and bones, the savage den she had heard about in Dust Creek. Before her lay a valley, hidden from the world, cupped in a protective hand of towering red cliffs. A narrow, silver creek ran through its center, and along its banks grew impossible, giant cottonwood trees, their leaves a vibrant, shimmering green that hurt her eyes after days of red and brown. There was life here. Small patches of corn and beans grew in cultivated plots. Smoke rose from dozens of cook fires, carrying the scent of roasting meat, wood smoke, and something sweet and herbal. The village itself was not a collection of tents, but of dome-shaped structures made of bent branches and covered in brush or hides. They were scattered, organic, looking as if they had grown from the earth itself. Dogs barked, children shouted and laughed in the distance. It was, she thought with a painful, hollow ache, beautiful. It was more of a home than the dying ranch she had just been sold to save. As they rode down the final slope into the valley floor, the sound stopped. The laughter of the children died. The barking of the dogs turned to low growls. The village, which had been alive with motion, went utterly still. People emerged from the lodges, from the creek bank, from the shade of the cottonwoods. They stood and stared. Women, their faces hard, pulled their children behind their skirts. Old men, their faces mapped with wrinkles, stood with a quiet, dangerous dignity. Young men, their bodies lean and scarred, put their hands on the knives at their belts. The reception in Dust Creek had been one of fear and hatred. This was different. This was a cold, profound, and unified wave of distrust. These were the people whose families had been killed by men who looked like her. She was not just a stranger. She was the enemy. Taji rode into the center of the village and dismounted. He did not speak. He simply stood by his horse, waiting. The 4 warriors who had ridden with him dispersed, melting back into the crowd, leaving him and Clara alone in the open space, the focus of every hostile eye. A woman strode out of the largest lodge. She was young, perhaps Clara's age, but she moved with an authority that made her seem older. She had the same high cheekbones and strong jaw as Taji. Her black hair was bound in 2 thick braids, and her eyes were as hard and bright as obsidian. She stopped 10 feet from Taji, her gaze fixed entirely on Clara. She spoke, her voice sharp and clear. In Apache, it was a question, an accusation. Taji answered her in a low, even tone. The woman's eyes flashed with anger. She spat a reply, this one more heated. Taji's voice remained calm, but it held a core of steel that made the air crackle. He spoke a single, final word. The woman turned her burning gaze on Clara. She looked her up and down, taking in the pale, frightened face, the ruined town dress, the dust-matted hair. Then, in slow, heavily accented English, she spoke, "So, you are the one." Clara could only nod, her throat too dry to speak. The woman, Nalin, stepped closer. "My brother, Taji, is a great warrior, but he is a fool if he thinks this brings peace." She gestured, her hand slicing the air. "Your people," she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss, "killed my mother. They killed my husband. They kill our children for sport." Her eyes bored into Clara's. "How many of our people did you cost? What was the price for one white girl?" Clara recoiled, the hatred hitting her like a physical blow. She had no answer. "Nalin," Taji said, "it was not a plea. It was a command. Nayland tore her gaze from Clara and stalked away. Two old men approached, their steps slow. One was thin and bent, his eyes clouded with age but missing nothing. The other was broader, more powerful, his face a mask of stern disapproval. This was the shaman, the village elder. They spoke to Taji for a long time. The entire village watched, listening. It was a debate, a formal argument. Clara, standing alone by the horse, understood nothing but the tones. The elders were angry, pleading, warning. Taji's replies were short, firm. He pointed not at Clara, but at the trail they had just ridden, toward the outside world. Finally, the shaman spoke, his voice rising in clear frustration. Taji answered, his own voice rising for the first time. Nalin, who had been watching from a distance, translated, her voice laced with bitter satisfaction. The elders say you are a bad spirit, that you bring the white man's sickness to our homes. They say you are the spark that will light the fire, and our children will burn. Clara's stomach turned to ice. And my brother, Nayland continued. He tells them they are blind. She looked at Clara with disgust. He says you are not a prize of war. He says you are a bridge. She laughed. A short, harsh sound. You do not look like a bridge. You look like a frightened rabbit. A very pale rabbit. Taji turned to Nalin and gave a command. Nayland's face tightened, but she nodded. She walked over to Clara and grabbed her arm. Her grip was like steel. Come, she said. The rabbit needs a hole. She did not lead Clara to Taji's lodge, the largest one. She dragged her to a small, utilitarian wickiup on the edge of the village, one used for storage or for women in their moontime. It was dark, smelled of dried herbs and dust, and contained nothing but a pile of buffalo robes. You will stay here, Nayland said. She pointed to a row of clay water pots by the creek. You will fetch water. You will grind corn. She threw a buckskin apron at Clara's feet. And you will not wear that. She meant the blue calico dress. It stinks of them. Nayland left, and Clara sank onto the robes, her body finally surrendering to the bone-deep exhaustion and terror. She was in their home, and she was hated. The days that followed were the hardest of her life. Nayland was a cold, demanding taskmistress. She showed Clara her duties once, with quick, impatient movements, and expected them to be done perfectly. Hauling water from the creek, her feet sinking into the mud, grinding corn on a stone medity until her shoulders and back screamed in protest, scraping hides until her hands, which she thought were already tough, bled anew. She learned quickly that her white world pious quiet was seen as weakness here, or worse, arrogance. The other women ignored her, walking past her as if she were a ghost, or whispering to each other and laughing. The children, braver, would sometimes circle her, staring before Nalin shooed them away. Clara was isolated, hungry, and worked to the point of collapse. But she did the work. She did it without complaint, her face set in a mask of stubborn endurance. She had survived her father. She had survived the drought. She would survive this. She was a bridge. She would be the strongest bridge they had ever seen. Taji, she rarely saw. He was gone from the village before sunrise, hunting or on patrol. He returned late, meeting with the elders or his warriors. He did not come to her lodge. He did not send for her. He had given her to Nalin, and that was all. The terror of the wedding night, of the violation she had expected, faded, replaced by a strange, aching confusion. She was his peace bride, but he did not want her. She was a symbol, a piece of property he had acquired and stored. One night, she was hauling a final pot of water back from the creek. The village was relaxing. A group of younger warriors were gathered around a fire, passing a skin bladder. She could smell the sharp, fermented scent of agave liquor. As she passed, one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a fresh scar on his cheek, called out in Apache, The others laughed. He called again, his voice thicker, bolder. Clara kept her eyes down, her heart pounding, and walked faster. He stood up, swaying slightly, and blocked her path. He said something, and the word white was clear. He reached out and tugged on her braid. Clara froze, the heavy pot digging into her hip. The other men laughed, encouraging him. He reached again, this time for her arm. "Kala, stop!" The voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it sliced through the night air like a thrown knife. The drunken warrior froze. His hand, halfway to her arm, dropped. The laughter of the other men died instantly. Taji stepped out of the shadow of his lodge. He was not wearing a weapon, but he did not need one. The authority radiated from him like a cold fire. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the group. He did not look at Clara. He looked at the warrior who had touched her. He spoke in Apache, his voice so low Clara could not hear the words. Only the terrifying, level calm. The warrior, suddenly sober, stammered a reply. Tazi hit him. It was not a brawl. It was a single, precise, open-handed blow to the chest that sounded like a rifle butt hitting a log. The man flew backward and crashed into the dirt, the air exploding from his lungs. Tazi stood over him. He spoke again, his voice still low, but this time every word was clear, sharp, and final. He looked around at the other silent, sobered men. He said something that included her name. Then he turned, looked at Clara, and simply nodded toward her lodge. She fled. Later, Naylin came to her wiki-up. She carried a bowl of hot stew. It was the first time she had brought Clara food. "You are safe," Naylin said, her voice flat. She did not meet Clara's eyes. "What did he say?" Clara whispered, her hands shaking as she took the bowl. Naylin stirred the fire. "He told them you are not a Neeti, not a slave. You are of his house. He told them if any man lays a hand on you, or speaks to you with disrespect again, he will cut that man's throat himself." Naylin finally looked at her, her expression conflicted. "He has claimed you. They will not touch you now, but they will hate you more. They will see you as the white woman who has bewitched our leader." Clara ate the stew, the warm, savory meat a comfort. He had protected her, he had claimed her, and in doing so, he had isolated her even more. But something in her changed. The fear began to recede. She started to watch, to learn. She learned the word for water, tu for bread, ithkan. She learned to make her face as impassive as theirs. One afternoon, she saw one of the small children, a boy of 4 or 5, fall and cut his knee on a sharp rock. His mother was down at the creek. The boy sat in the dust, his face screwed up, trying not to cry. Clara went to him. He flinched, his eyes wide. "I know," she said softly. "It hurts." She used the Apache word she had learned for hurt. She tore a clean strip from her buckskin apron, dipped it in her water pot, and gently, carefully, washed the cut. She used another strip to bind it. The boy watched her, his thumb in his mouth. When she was done, she smiled. She did not know the Apache words, so she told him a story her mother had told her, about a jackrabbit who outran the rain. He just stared, uncomprehending, but her voice was soft, and he did not pull away. Naylin had been watching from the lodge. She said nothing, but that evening, she showed Clara how to properly soften a hide with a bone scraper, her hands guiding Clara's, her impatience slightly less sharp. It was a beginning. Weeks passed. The brutal heat of summer softened into the crisp, clear gold of autumn. The moon grew full, a cold silver plate hanging between the canyon walls. One night, Clara could not sleep. The weight of her new life, the confusion of her status, pressed down on her. She was a peace bride who was not a wife. She was a captive who was protected. She was a bridge that no one wanted to cross. She left her lodge and walked to the edge of the creek, sitting on a smooth, flat rock. She watched the moonlight glitter on the water. She thought of her father, of Dust Creek, of the life that was now as distant as the moon itself. "You should not be out alone." His voice came from the shadow behind her. She did not jump. She realized, been waiting for him. Taji stepped into the moonlight. He did not have his rifle, only the knife at his belt. He watched her for a long moment. "You are not cold?" he asked. She shook her head. Though she was wearing a simple buckskin dress Nalin had given her, and the night air was sharp. He walked back to his lodge and returned with a heavy, thick buffalo robe. He did not throw it. He walked up behind her and gently, almost formally, draped it over her shoulders. The fur was thick, warm, and carried his scent smoke and the high, clean desert. He sat, not on the rock beside her, but on the ground a few feet away. He did not crowd her. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the creek. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice rough. "Why what? Why did you do it in the town? Why did you say those things about protecting me, about my wishes?" He picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his hands. "The white men, Briggs. He wanted a fight. He wanted a reason. He wanted me to be the animal he says I am." He looked at her. "He wanted me to take you, like a dog takes a bone. And you did not." "No." "Why?" He looked away. "Up at the cliffs. My people, we have rules. We do not steal women. We do not force." His voice hardened. "The bluecoats, they did, to my sister, to my wife." Clara's breath caught. It was the first time he had spoken of her. "He wanted a monster," Taji said, his voice a low growl. "I would not give him one." "But you still took me," she said, the bitterness rising. "My father, he sold me to clear his debt. I was just a payment." "I know what you were," he said. He met her gaze. "I know what he did. I know what they all did. They gave you to save themselves, and you accepted." "I accepted," he agreed. "But not for him, not for them." "Then why?" she demanded, her voice shaking now. "For my people," he said simply. "To stop the railroad men, to stop the war, to buy one more day, one more week." He tossed the stone into the creek. It made a small, soft splash. You were a sacrifice. I am a sacrifice. We are the same." Clara stared at him, the man the world called a monster. He understood. He saw her not as a price, but as a person in the same trap. "I'm so afraid," she whispered, the admission tearing out of her. "I am so alone." He looked at her, and the hardness in his face softened, just for a moment, replaced by the profound, aching sadness she had seen in the square. He stood up and held out his hand. She looked at it, a strong, calloused, scarred hand. Slowly, her own will moving her. She put her trembling fingers into his. He did not pull her up. He just held her hand, his thumb gently rubbing the back of her knuckles. It was a human touch, the first she had felt in so long that was not rough or impatient. She stood, but she did not let go of his hand. She stepped closer. She looked up into his face, into the dark eyes that had seen so much death. "I am not what they say," he said, his voice rough. "I know," she whispered. She rose on her toes, her heart a wild, frantic drum. She did not know where the courage came from, but she knew, in that instant, that she was done being a victim. She was done being a payment. She put her free hand on his chest. She could feel his heart, steady and strong, under her palm. And then, trembling, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a practiced kiss. It was hesitant, soft, a question. He went utterly still. For a heartbeat, he did not respond, as if shocked by her own boldness. Then, his hand tightened on hers. His other hand came up, very slowly, and cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He did not grab her. He did not force. He tilted his head and kissed her back. It was a slow, deep, devastatingly gentle kiss. It was not the kiss of a savage, or a master. It was a kiss of shared grief, of aching loneliness, of a fragile, impossible hope. It was warm, and it was devastatingly real. It tasted of wood smoke and the cold night air. When he broke the kiss, he did not let her go. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. She could feel his breath, warm on her face. He was, she realized with a jolt, trembling. He held her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her close against the warmth of his body. Her head tucked under his chin. She was not a sacrifice. She was not a prisoner. She was in the arms of the one man who had looked at her and seen a human being. Clara pressed her face into the soft buckskin of his shirt and, for the first time since her mother had died, she felt the impossible, treacherous, and undeniable sensation of being safe. She was no longer just the girl who was given, in the dark, hidden valley. She had, in her own way, finally begun to choose. That night by the creek had been a fragile truce, a moment of warmth stolen from a world that did not allow it. But the world did not stop. The pressure from the outside, which had been a distant thunder, was now the roar of an approaching storm. Back in Dust Creek, Colonel Briggs was furious. His plan to provoke Tazi Nez had failed. The savage had not acted like one, and the town, while still afraid, was now confused. He needed a new lever. He found it 3 days later. A supply wagon, bound for a mining camp, was found burned in a gully 20 miles south of town. The 2 drivers were dead, killed by arrows. It was a brutal, ugly scene. That night, Briggs stood on the bar of the Thirsty Devil, a broken Apache arrow in his hand. "I gave them a chance," he roared, his voice thick with righteous fury. "We offered them peace. We gave them a sacrifice. A decent, pious girl. And how do they repay us? By burning our wagons, by murdering our men." He threw the arrow onto the bar, where it clattered among the whiskey glasses. "This," he spat, "is their answer. This is the peace of Tazi Nez. He took the girl, and now he shows his true colors. He and his band are nothing but murderers." The town, which had been hesitant, now found its voice in a collective, angry growl. The ambiguity was gone. They had been fools to trust. The blacksmith, the freighters, even some of the women, were now united in their fear and rage. Briggs had his excuse. "We will not wait for them to burn us in our beds," Briggs declared. "The army will act. We will move, and we will move now. We will clear that den of snakes, and we will bring Clara Hayes what is left of her home." A ragged, whiskey-fueled cheer went up. Briggs smiled. The war he wanted was finally his. 2 days later, a pair of surveyors in dusty civilian clothes reported to Briggs's office. They unrolled a large map on his desk, weighting the corners with rocks. "It is perfect, Colonel," the older man said, tracing a line with his finger. The line ran directly through a blank spot on the map, a spot marked only with a crude drawing of mountains. "This valley," the surveyor said, his finger tapping the blank space, "is the only route. It is level. It has a steady supply of water from a creek, and it avoids the granite ridges to the north. The railroad must go through here." Briggs looked at the map. The line the man's finger had drawn was pointed straight at the heart of the hidden Apache Valley. "Then," Briggs said, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face, "we had best get those lands liberated. It is a matter of national progress, after all." The news, when it came to the valley, came on the back of a near-dead horse. A young scout, one Clara had not seen before, stumbled into the village, an arrow shaft broken off in his shoulder. He fell from his horse and was carried to the shaman's lodge. A low, anxious murmur spread through the village. Clara, who was scraping a hide with Nalin, felt the change instantly. The sounds of children playing stopped. Women left their cook fires. Tazi was summoned. Emerging from a council with the elders, he ran to the shaman's lodge, his face a mask of grim concern. Clara and Nalin followed, standing outside the circle of anxious warriors. They could not hear the words, Only the low, pained voice of the scout and the sharp, angry questions from the elders. After a long time, Tazi emerged. His face was like carved stone. "What is it?" Nalin asked, her voice tight with fear. Taji looked at his sister, then, reluctantly, at Clara. Rancheria, to the south, near the Dragoon Mountains. It was burned. By who? Soldiers, bluecoats. They came in the night. They killed everyone. The women, the children. The scout was the only one to escape. A woman nearby, who had family in that band, let out a high, keening wail that cut through the valley. The peace was over. The war was here. That night, the drums started. A low, rhythmic, angry pulse that vibrated in Clara's chest. The entire village gathered in the central clearing, their faces painted by the light of a huge bonfire. The elders spoke, their voices rising with anger. The warriors chanted, stamping their feet, their knives and rifles held high. They were preparing for war. Clara watched from the shadows of her lodge. She was terrified. This was the savagery the town feared, but she saw it differently now. She saw the grief, the rage of a people being hunted. She heard her own name. One of the elders, the shaman, was pointing, not at her, but at Tazi's lodge. He was shouting, his voice thick with accusation. Nalin, who had been standing with the women, came to Clara's side, her face pale. "What is he saying?" Clara whispered. "He is blaming Taji," Nalin whispered back, her voice shaking. "He says this is the fruit of his foolishness. He says Taji brought the white fire into our valley." She looked at Clara, her eyes dark. "He means you. He says you are the curse. You have broken the balance. He is demanding that Taji give you back, as a hostage, to prove his loyalty to the people." Clara's blood ran cold. "Give me back. To the soldiers, to show we do not want war, to trade for peace. But they will kill me, or worse." He says one white woman's life is not worth the lives of our children." The village was divided. Some warriors shouted in agreement with the elder. Others shouted their loyalty to Tazi. The valley, which had been a sanctuary, was now a tinderbox, and she was the spark. She felt a terrible, tearing guilt. She loved these people. She loved the children she had told stories to. She loved Nalin, and she loved Taji. But the elder was right. Her presence here was the excuse Briggs needed. She was the white fire. Taji stood alone, facing the shaman. He let the old man speak, his face impassive. When the accusations had run their course, Taji finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the drums. "She is not a hostage. She is a white skin," the shaman roared. "She is of my house," Taji stated, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "I claimed her. She is under my protection. The war has come. Yes, it has come because of the Iron Horse, not because of one woman. Briggs wants this land. He does not care if she is here or in Dust Creek. He will kill us all regardless. To give her up is not peace. It is cowardice. It is a sacrifice to a god who will not listen." He turned to the warriors. "We will not give up our own. We will fight for this land, for our families, and for her." A roar went up from the younger warriors. The debate was over. Tazi had won, but it was a victory that had cost him the support of the elders. He was now at odds with his own traditions. While the valley prepared for battle, Colonel Briggs was solidifying his legal position. He sent a squad of 5 soldiers to the Hayes Ranch. They found Eli in the house, sitting in the dark, a half-empty bottle in his hand. He was a broken man, haunted by the image of his daughter riding away. They did not knock. They kicked the door in. "Eli Hayes," the sergeant said, leveling his rifle. "You are under arrest." "Arrest for what?" Eli stammered. "For aiding and abetting the enemy. For consorting with hostiles." They dragged him from the house, threw him over a saddle, and took him to the Army stockade in Dust Creek. They left him in a dark, hot, windowless cell for a full day, with no water and no food. On the second day, Colonel Briggs entered, carrying a lantern and a canteen. He placed both on the small table. just out of Eli's reach. "You are in a great deal of trouble." "Eli," Briggs said, his voice almost gentle, "I did what Carter said," Eli croaked, his tongue thick. I gave my daughter." "You did," Briggs agreed. "And now she is with them. She is a collaborator, and you, her father, are therefore a traitor. A court-martial will find you guilty. You will be hanged." Eli began to weep, a dry, racking sob. "No, please, I did it for the town." "There is," Briggs said, moving the canteen an inch closer. "One way out." He produced a folded piece of paper and a pen. "A statement. For the territorial record, a confession." "A confession of what?" "That the Apaches, led by Taji Nez, have been threatening you for months, that they were the ones who demanded your daughter, that they swore to burn the town if you did not comply, that they were the ones who burned the supply wagon. A full accounting of their aggression." "But that is not— they did not—" "It is the truth, Eli," Briggs said, his voice hardening. "It is the truth that will save your neck. Sign it, and you are a witness for the territory. I will see your debt is cleared, and your ranch is protected. Refuse." He shrugged. "The hangman needs the practice." He pushed the canteen and the paper across the table. Eli Hayes, destroyed by thirst, guilt, and terror, picked up the pen. His hand shook so violently he could barely form the letters. He signed his name to the lie, the official license for the massacre Briggs planned to unleash. The final piece of the trap was set not by a soldier, but by one of the Apache themselves. His name was Taza. He was the young, broad-shouldered warrior Tazi had struck down for touching Clara. He had not forgotten the humiliation. He was jealous of Tazi's power, and he hated Clara, the white woman who had been the cause of his shame. In the dead of night, he slipped out of the valley. He rode south, avoiding the scouts. He found a small army patrol and, holding his hands high, surrendered. He was taken to Briggs. "I know him," Taza said, through the translator Pete. "I know Tazi Nez." "What about him?" Briggs asked. "Interested. He is bewitched by the white woman. He will not listen to the elders. He keeps her in his own lodge now." This was a lie, but Taza knew it was what the colonel wanted to hear. "He plans to attack, to take the town. He is gathering warriors." "When?" "Soon. 3 days. He knows you are coming, but he does not know a second way." "A back way into the valley." "A back way." Briggs leaned forward, his eyes alight. "A small trail. For goats, wide enough for men on foot. It comes out on the cliffs, high above his lodge. You could have 50 men, 100 men, inside the rancheria before the first warrior could grab his rifle." Briggs smiled. "And why are you telling me this?" Taza, because he struck me, because he dishonored me. For her." Taza's face was a mask of hatred. "I want him dead. I want her dead. You give me a rifle, a new rifle, and I will show you the trail myself." "You will get your rifle," Briggs said, "and a great deal more." In the valley, the air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and fear. The war preparations were everywhere. Women were packing food. Men were checking their rifles, tipping their arrows. That night, Tazi came to Clara's lodge. She had not been alone with him since the night by the creek. He stood in the opening, a tall, dark shadow against the stars. "Clara," he said, his voice low. "I am here." He stepped inside. The lodge was small, and his presence filled it. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than she had ever seen them. "They will come," he said. It was not a question. "I know. Briggs, he is a hard man. He will not stop. He has his excuse now. The burned wagon," she whispered. He nodded. "My scouts found the tracks. The arrows were old, stolen. The tracks, they were shod horses, soldiers. It was a lie. They will believe it," she said. "Yes." He sat on the robe across from her, his hands clasped between his knees. "When they come." "It will be a bad fight. This valley is strong." But they have many guns. Cannons. Maybe? He looked at her, his gaze direct and heavy. If the fight is bad, if the line breaks, I want you to go. Go where? I have a man, Nalen's cousin. He will wait for you by the North Pass. He will have a horse. He will take you back to the town. Clara stared at him. Back to Dust Creek. Back to her father. Back to the people who had sold her. A month ago, she would have wept with gratitude for such an offer. Now, the thought was a cold, sick dread. Go back, she said, her voice shaking. To them, they hate me. Taji, they think I am one of you now. A traitor. And my father. I have no home there. You will be safe, he insisted, his voice rough. You are a white woman, Briggs. He will not harm you. Not once you are away from me. You do not know him, she said, a new, cold anger rising in her. He does not care about me. He cares about this land. He cares about his war. He will use me as a rescued captive and hang you as my murderer. It is better than this. He gestured to the village, to the sound of the war drums. Better than what? She asked, her voice rising. Being here with you. The internal battle she had been fighting for weeks finally broke open. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was something new, something hard and bright. It was loyalty. It was love. I am not, she said, her voice low and fierce. The girl they gave you, Taji, I am not a sack of flour to be traded back and forth. I will not run. I will not go back to them. He looked at her, his eyes wide, startled by her fire. This is my home now, she said, the words surprising her with their absolute truth. These people, Nalin, the children, they are my people now, as much as they hate me. She stood up. And you are my... She could not say the word. I will not leave you to fight this alone, she finished, her voice trembling but unbroken. I will not run. He stood, his face a conflict of awe, fear, and a pain so deep it stole her breath. He wanted to protect her, to send her away from the fire he had been accused of bringing. And she, the white fire herself, was refusing to go. She was choosing to stand in the flames with him. Clara, he whispered, his voice full of gravel. He reached out, his hand hovering, not quite touching her. I am staying, she said. I am not that weak girl anymore. You have taught me that. Now, tell me, when they come, how do we fight them? He stared at her, and the last of his resistance broke. He saw not a white woman, not a burden, but a warrior. They will come from the South Pass, he said, his voice all strategy now. It is the only way in. We will line the canyon walls. And as he spoke, miles away, in the cold, dark hills, the warrior Taza was leading a silent line of blue-coated soldiers toward a goat trail, a trail that led to the cliffs high above their heads. The pre-dawn air in the valley was sharp with a metallic tang of fear. The drums had finally gone silent, replaced by the much quieter, more terrifying sounds of preparation. Warriors checked their ammunition. Women bundled dried food in water skins, and children, sensing the terror, huddled silently, their eyes wide. Taji stood with his main group of warriors near the mouth of the South Pass, the only entrance Clara had ever seen. The plan was simple, and it was desperate. They would bottleneck the soldiers in the narrow canyon, buying time for the elders to lead the women and non-combatants up the high trails, into the inaccessible wilderness of the inner mountains. A scout appeared on the ridge, a dark shape against the graying sky. He did not whoop or call. He rode his horse hard down the slope, a sign of terrible urgency. He slid from the sweating animal before it had even stopped, running to Tazi. He spoke, his words low and frantic, his chest heaving. Clara, standing nearby with Nalin, did not need to understand the words. She could read the terror in the man's face. Taji's entire body went rigid. He replied with a sharp, disbelieving question. The scout nodded, gesturing wildly back the way he had come. "What is it?" Nayland demanded. Moving forward, Tazi turned, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were blazing. "Briggs is not just bringing soldiers. He has talking iron. Cannons." Nayland's voice was thin. "No, worse." Tazi's gaze found Clara. "He has wagons, 3 of them, heavy. The scout says they are filled with black powder, explosives." The shaman, who was nearby, overheard. "Explosives." "The scout heard the soldiers talking," Taji said, his voice flat. "They do not plan to fight us in the pass. They plan to seal it, to collapse the canyon walls. They mean to bury us in here. All of us." A cold, sick dread, far worse than anything she had felt before, washed over Clara. This was not a battle. This was an extermination. Briggs did not mean to drive them out. He meant to erase them, to turn their beautiful, hidden valley into a mass grave. The elders began to wail. The warriors looked at each other, their faces ashen. "How did you fight a mountain that was falling on you?" "We must run," the old shaman said, his voice cracking. "All of us, now, to the high trails." "We cannot," Taji said, shaking his head. "The column is too close. They will be at the pass in an hour. The women and children will be caught on the open slopes. We must hold them at the pass, and be buried alive." Clara's mind was racing. Explosives, wagons. She had grown up around both. She had watched the railroad crews blasting rock, and she had seen her father handle the dynamite he used for clearing stumps. She knew about fuses. She knew about harnesses and linchpins. "Wait," she said, her voice quiet but piercing the circle of panicked men. They all turned to look at her. The white woman. The curse. "He has to bring the wagons up the main trail, does he not?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. "The trail is narrow. It winds along the creek bed." Tazi nodded, wary. "Yes, it is the only way for wagons." "Then we do not stop the soldiers," she said, thinking aloud, her heart hammering. "We stop the wagons." "How?" Tazi asked. "They will be guarded. In the center of the column." "There is another way," she said, looking up at the high cliffs. "The goat trail. The one you showed me. The one that circles around the south ridge." "It is too dangerous," Taji said instantly. "A fall means death." "But it is faster than the wagon trail," she insisted, her mind seeing the map clearly now. "And it comes out above the trail, just before the pass. We can get there before them. If we can stop that first wagon, we can block the trail. The others will not be able to pass." The warriors stared at her. The old shaman looked at her as if she were insane. But Tazi was not. He was looking at her with a new, sharp intensity. He saw the logic. It was a desperate, foolish plan. A plan that might cost them their lives. It was the only plan they had. "Nalin," he barked. "Take the women. Go. Now. Move to the high caves. Take the old ones and the children. Go!" Nalin looked at her brother, then at Clara, her expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. But she did not argue. She began shouting commands, gathering the panicked non-combatants. Taji turned to his warriors. "You," he said, pointing to his best 10 men. "Come with me. We will hold the pass as long as we can. We will give her time." He looked at the remaining men. "The rest of you, go with Nalin. Protect the people. Go." The men scattered. Taji grabbed his rifle. "No," Clara said, grabbing his arm. He stopped. "You cannot. You know the way. But I know the wagons. I know the powder. You have to come with me. Your men can hold the pass. But only you and I can do this." He stared at her, the internal warplane on his face. "To leave the main defense, to trust this." "She is right," a voice said. It was the old shaman. He had walked up to them, his face grim. "This is a white man's plan. It needs a white man's knowledge. And it needs your eyes. Taji Nez, go. We will hold the pass. We will sing the old songs. We will buy you the time." Taji looked at the old man, a new respect in his eyes. He nodded once. "Hold them. Then fall back to the north. We will meet you there. Or we will not." He grabbed Clara's hand. "Come." And pray to your God, white woman, because if you slip, I will not be able to catch you." The goat trail was not a trail. It was a suggestion of a path, a series of crumbling ledges and steep, gravel-filled chutes. They moved at a terrifying pace, half running, half climbing. Taze moved like a shadow, his feet finding holds that Clara could not see. She scrambled after him, her lungs burning, her hands raw and bleeding. The buckskin dress, which had felt so practical, now snagged on thorns and rocks. Nature itself was their enemy. A sudden cold rain had fallen in the high country during the night, and the seasonal stream they had to cross was no longer a trickle. It was a churning, waist-deep torrent of brown, icy water that threatened to pull them from their feet. Taji forged it first, then came back, bracing himself against the current as he half carried her across, the force of the water nearly tearing her from his grasp. But the land was also their ally. The high, tangled brush and the sheer canyon walls hid them from the valley floor below. They were moving above the world, like ghosts, unseen. They had been climbing for nearly an hour when Tazi suddenly froze. He pulled her flat against a rock wall, his hand over her mouth. His body was tense, his head cocked. Clara listened. At first, she heard nothing but the wind and her own ragged breathing. Then she heard it, the scrape of a boot on rock, laughter, low and rough, and the smell of cheap tobacco. He mouthed one word, "Soldiers!" She peered over the edge of the rock. On a wide ledge 50 yards ahead, where the trail turned, sat 3 men. They were not in blue coats. They were civilians, hard-looking men in dusty clothes, each holding a repeating rifle, hired guns. Briggs had posted flankers to protect his advance. They were directly in the path. There was no way around. Taji slowly, silently, drew the knife from his belt. He was going to try to take them. 3 of them. "No," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Your rifle," he shook his head. A shot would echo through the entire canyon. It would alert the main column. He put his finger to his lips. He began to creep forward, a shadow moving over the rock. He was 10 feet from them when one of the men stood up to stretch, turning, and saw him. The man's eyes went wide. He did not shout. He simply grabbed his rifle and fired. The shot was a deafening crack. The bullet sparked off the rock just inches from Tazi's head. Taji lunged, his knife flashing. He tackled the first man, and they went down in a tangle of limbs. The other 2 men, shouting in surprise, scrambled to their feet, bringing their rifles around. They were aiming at Tazi, who was on the ground, struggling with the first gunman. Clara screamed. "No!" She ran forward, waving her arms, a desperate, foolish distraction. One of the gunmen turned his rifle toward her. He grinned, a cruel, yellow-toothed expression. He was raising his rifle to fire at her when Taji, having dispatched the first man, threw himself through the air. Taji did not hit the gunman. He hit Clara. He slammed into her with the force of a bull, his arms wrapping around her, driving her backward. He was trying to get her behind the cover of a large boulder. The world spun. She felt a jarring, terrible impact as her back hit the rock. And she heard, at the same instant, a wet, sickening thump. Taji grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain that was not a word. His body, which had been a shield of iron, suddenly went heavy. He collapsed against her, his head falling into the hollow of her shoulder. "Taji!" she screamed, her voice breaking. He was still. For one horrifying second, she thought he was dead. Then he groaned, pushing himself up, his face a mask of agony. His left shoulder, the buckskin was dark, wet. It was not water. It was blood, pumping, staining the pale leather a deep, terrible crimson. "Go!" he gasped, pushing her again. "Behind the rock! You are shot!" she cried, her hands coming up, covered in his blood. "Do it!" He roared and fired his rifle, one-handed at the 2 remaining gunmen, who had taken cover. The shot drove them back. Clara, sobbing, scrambled behind the boulder. Taji fell in beside her, slumping against the stone, his rifle clattering to the ground. He was pale, his teeth gritted. It is bad," he whispered, his eyes clouded with pain. She looked at the wound. It was high in his shoulder, and it was bleeding badly. Panic, cold and white, seized her. She was going to watch him die. Then, the panic broke, replaced by a cold, hard rage. The image of her father's dying cattle, of a calf she had stitched up, flashed in her mind. "No," she said, her voice flat. She grabbed the hem of her buckskin dress, the one Nayland had given her, with her teeth in her hands. She tore a long, thick strip from it. "This will hurt," she said. He nodded, his eyes closed. She balled up a piece of the leather and pressed it hard into the bleeding wound. He cried out, a muffled, sharp sound, and his whole body arched in agony. "Hold it," she commanded. "Press on it, hard." He put his good hand over hers, his fingers white with pressure. The gunfire from the two men stopped. She heard them shouting to each other. They were going to rush them. Taji fumbled for his rifle, his face slick with sweat. He could barely lift it. One of the men broke cover, running toward them, his rifle at his hip. Taji tried to aim, his arms shaking. Clara looked at the rifle. She had never fired a gun in her life, except her father's old shotgun. Once, at a snake, she grabbed it. It was heavy and smelled of powder and oil. She pointed it over the top of the rock. Her hands were shaking so badly she could not hold it steady. She saw the man, a dark, running shape. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her own shoulder. A brutal, painful kick that knocked her back. The sound was deafening. She opened her eyes. The man was gone. You missed," Tazi gasped, a strange, pained laugh in his voice. "I did not," she whispered. The man was not gone. He was on the ground, not moving. She felt a wave of nausea so powerful she thought she would be sick. She had just killed a man. The other gunman, seeing his partner fall, let out a yell of rage and began firing wildly, the bullets chipping at the rock above their heads. "We have to go," Taji said, trying to stand, his face a sheet of white. "The wagon. You cannot walk. I must." He pushed himself up, leaning on her. "Give me the rifle," she said. He looked at her. "Give it to me, I will. I will hold him off. You go. You stop the wagon. You do not know how? Then you must come with me." She put her arm around his waist, pulling his good arm over her shoulder. He was a dead weight. Together, they staggered from behind the rock. The last gunman fired, the shot going wide. Clara, supporting Tazi, grabbed the rifle again. She aimed in the direction of the shots and fired, not at the man, but at the rocks near him. The gunman ducked. "Run!" she screamed, half-dragging Taji. They stumbled, fell, and scrambled down the last, steep chute, sliding in the gravel, protected by the bend in the trail. They were out of the line of fire. Below them, perhaps 500 yards down the canyon, they saw it. The column. It was a long blue snake, winding its way up the trail. And in the middle, drawn by a team of 6 straining mules, was the first wagon. It was heavy, laden with wooden crates. The explosives. We are too late," Tazi panted, sinking to his knees. "I cannot—" "Yes, we can," she said. She was breathing hard, her body screaming with effort. But her mind was cold, clear. "You stay here. You have your rifle. If any of those soldiers, if they come up this trail, you stop them. Clara, you stop them," she commanded. She looked at him, at the blood staining his chest, at the pain in his eyes. "Do not die," she said, her voice fierce. "Do not you dare die." She took his knife from his belt. She took a spare powder horn and a cap. "I will be back." She did not wait for an answer. She scrambled down the rock face, moving from bush to boulder, her earlier clumsiness gone, replaced by a desperate, focused grace. She was no longer a pious girl. She was not a sacrifice. She was a warrior, her mother's blue dress long gone, her own dress stained with her husband's blood, and a dead man's rifle in her hands. She reached the trail 200 yards ahead of the wagon. She could hear the creak of the wheels, the shouts of the mule skinners. She hid behind a jumble of fallen rocks. The wagon lumbered closer. 2 men walked beside it, their rifles slung. She waited. Let it get closer. Now. She stepped out, took aim at the lead mule, and fired. The mule screamed and fell. The team went into instant, tangled panic. "Ambush!" the soldiers yelled. The wagon ground to a halt. "What is it?" a voice roared from the back of the column. "Get that wagon moving!" Clara dropped the rifle. She ran, low and fast, toward the panicked team. The 2 guards, confused, fired into the rocks above her. She reached the wagon. She used Tazi's knife. She did not cut the traces. She cut the main harness strap on the other lead mule. The animal, suddenly free, bolted, taking the rest of the team with it. They scrambled up the hill, a tangle of leather and panicked horseflesh. "Stop them!" One of the guards saw her. He raised his rifle. A shot cracked from the cliffs far above. The guard spun around and fell, clutching his leg. Tazi. He was still watching. He was still fighting. Clara ran to the side of the wagon. She knew what to look for. She found the heavy linchpin on the front wheel and, using a rock, smashed it, jamming it sideways. The wheel was locked. She heard shouting. More soldiers were running up the trail. She looked in the back of the wagon. Crates of powder, and a small box, fuses, and sticks of dynamite. She grabbed one. She grabbed a short fuse. She cut it. 3 inches. "Clara!" Tazi's voice was a distant scream. A soldier was rounding the wagon, his bayonet fixed. She capped the fuse, struck the match from the box, and lit it. The fuse sputtered. The soldier saw her. His eyes went wide. She did not throw it at him. She did not throw it in the wagon. She looked up. Above the trail was a high, sheer wall of loose rock, shattered by ice and time. With all her strength, she threw the lit stick of dynamite up, onto the ledge above the trail. "Get back!" she screamed, and dove off the side of the trail, rolling into the creek bed. The world dissolved in a roar of thunder. The explosion was not large, but it was perfect. It shattered the unstable ledge. 1,000,000 tons of rock, dust, and gravel let go with a groan. It did not hit the wagon. It hit the trail 20 feet in front of it. A wall of stone, 10 feet high, slammed down, completely, utterly, and permanently blocking the path. The entire column ground to a halt. The trail was gone. Far back in the column, Colonel Briggs, his face purple with rage, stared through his field glasses. He saw the chaos. He saw the blocked trail, and then he saw them. High on the cliff, 2 figures. One was the Apache leader, Tazi Nez, leaning heavily on the other. The other, it was a woman, a small, furious figure, covered in blood and dirt, helping the warrior escape. He focused the lenses. It was her, Clara Hayes, the untouched Hayes girl. She was not a captive. She was not a victim. She was fighting with him. She was fighting for him. "Find another way," he roared at his men. I want them both. You find me that girl and you bring me that savage's head, I will hang what is left of him in the town square." The rock slide had bought them time, but it had not bought them peace. Clara half-dragged, half-carried Tazi back up the goat trail, his good arm thrown over her shoulder, his blood hot and sticky against her neck. They found the remaining warriors, the old shaman and Nalin in the high caves, their faces etched with terror. The victory was hollow. Tazi was alive, but the bullet had gone deep. He was slick with sweat, his skin pale beneath his copper tone. He was gripped by a high, raging fever. Nalin and the shaman worked over him, packing the wound with herbs, but his breathing was shallow. He had saved her, and she had, in turn, saved the valley, but the cost was terrible. And in Dust Creek, the fire of hatred was being stoked to a white heat. The lone surviving gunman from the flanker team had stumbled back to Briggs, his story a wild, terrified tale. "It was her," he babbled, his eyes wide. "The girl, she's with him. She shot Jed. She killed him. She blew the pass. She's one of them. An animal. Briggs had seized on the story, his fury at the failed attack turning into a brilliant, new opportunity. He displayed the gunman in the thirsty devil, letting him tell his tale over and in. You see, Briggs had roared to the assembled, panicked town. She is not a captive. She is a turncoat. She has been defiled, her mind poisoned by that savage. She is a traitor to her own kind, murdering decent men. The town's lingering pity for Clara the Pious curdled into a righteous, ugly rage. She was not a victim. She was a monster, worse than the Apache, because she had been one of them. They are a nest of vipers, Briggs shouted. And she is the worst of them. They have wounded our soldiers. They have murdered our citizens. I am declaring martial law. Every man here with a rifle will be deputized. We will not be stopped by one rock slide. We will go back, and we will burn that valley to the ground. We will wipe this stain from the earth. A mob, drunk on fear and whiskey, cheered him on. They demanded a final, bloody end. In the cave, Tazi woke on the third day. The fever had broken. He was weak, his body hollowed out by the infection, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Clara, who had not left his side. He will come back, Tazi whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Yes, Clara said, her hand tightening on his good one. We know. The goat trail, Taza. He will bring them that way. We cannot hold it. We will fight, Nayland said, her voice fierce, though her eyes were shadowed with despair. Tazi looked at Clara. He saw not the pale, frightened girl from the square, but the woman who had fired a rifle, thrown dynamite, and dragged him up a cliff. He saw the woman who had refused to leave him. He uses you, Taji said, his voice gaining a fraction of its strength. As his excuse, his white woman captive, his defiled girl. As long as you are missing, he has a reason to kill us all. Clara looked at him, her heart sinking. She knew what he was saying. You want me to leave, to give myself up. No, he said. Giving you up is surrender. That is what he wants. He would call you a liar and kill me anyway. No, we do not give you up. We take his reason away. Nalin and the shaman stared at him. Brother, what are you saying? We are going back, Tazi said. Back? Nayland's voice was a shocked whisper. To Dust Creek. They will hang you from the saloon roof. They will kill us all if we stay here, Taji said, his gaze locked with Clara's. He has told them a story. About a monster, about a captive girl. We must show them the truth, in the light, where all of them can see. It was the most terrifying gamble Clara could imagine. To walk back into the lion's den, to face the mob. He is right, Clara said, her voice shaking but steady. They will not listen to rumors. They must see. It is suicide, Nalin pleaded. It is a chance, Taji said. He gripped Clara's hand with his good one. It is the only one. The journey back was a waking dream, a slow pilgrimage of pain. Taji could barely sit his horse, but he would not ride another. It had to be his red war horse, the symbol of the Ghost Rider, for the last mile. As the squat, familiar buildings of Dust Creek shimmered in the heat haze, Taji gathered the last of his strength. He was a warrior, and he would enter as one. Clara, he grunted, his face pale with the effort. She knew what he wanted. She mounted the horse first. He swung his good leg over, settling behind her. His body slumped. His wounded left arm was in a crude sling Nalin had fashioned from a torn piece of Clara's dress. His one good arm, his right, came around her waist, holding her, his hand resting on her hip. The image was a deliberate, shocking proclamation. The white girl, not dragged behind, but held in the arms of the Apache leader. They rode out of the shimmering heat and onto the end of the main street. A child, playing with a stick, was the first to see them. He screamed and ran. A door slammed. A man shouted, "It is him, the Apache. He is here." The town, which had been preparing for an invasion, was thrown into chaos. But they did not hide. They were a deputized mob, and their enemy had just delivered himself. Doors burst open. Men ran into the street, rifles in hand. The blacksmith, the freighters, the shopkeeper. They formed a wide, angry half-circle, their guns all pointing at the single red horse and its two riders. Colonel Briggs stormed out of his office, his cavalry pistol in his hand, his face a mask of triumph. "Well, well," he boomed, striding into the center of the square, stopping 20 yards from them. "The savage delivers himself, and he brings his traitor whore with him." He turned to the crowd, his voice full of righteous, theatrical rage. "You see, he flaunts his prize. He has kidnapped this poor, simple-minded girl. He has defiled her, and now he brings her back to mock us. Men, prepare to fire. We are rescuing Miss Hayes." The clicks of rifle hammers, 100 small, metallic sounds, cut through the silence. The crowd surged, their faces twisted with hatred, ready to tear them apart. But before a single man could move, before Briggs could give the order, Clara acted. She was not a captive. She would not be rescued. She swung her leg over and slid from the horse. She landed on the dusty ground. On her own 2 feet, she stood, not by the horse, but in front of it, a small, defiant figure. Her buckskin dress was torn, filthy, and stained a dark, rusty brown with Tazi's blood. Her face was tanned by the sun, her hair matted. She ripped the red scarf from her neck. She turned, reached up, and placed her hand on Tazi's good hand, the one still holding the saddle horn. He looked down at her, his eyes full of pain and a fierce, burning pride. She held his hand. She turned, deliberately, to face the guns and the hate. "I was given to this man," she shouted, her voice raw, cracking the thick, hot air. The crowd stilled, shocked by her voice, her stance. "You all watched," she cried, her eyes sweeping over them, landing on the blacksmith, on Mrs. Miller, on Banker Carter, who was watching from the saloon porch. "My father sold me to pay his debt. You all watched him do it. You called me untouched and pious, and you fed me to a man you called a monster." A low murmur of shame rippled through the crowd. "You waited for him to drag me away," she continued, her voice shaking with a fury she had never known she possessed. "And you," she pointed at Briggs, "you wanted him to be a monster because it gave you your excuse." She held up Tazi's hand, the one she was still grasping. "But he was not from the day I left this town. This savage has shown me more decency, more honor than any of you. No one laid a hand on me without my consent." The crowd was stunned into silence. This was not the story they had been told. "He did not hold me captive," she screamed, tears of rage and loyalty streaming down her dusty cheeks. "He saved me. He saved me from the sandstorm. He protected me from men who would have hurt me. And he is wounded. He is bleeding because he took a bullet that was meant for me." She let go of Tazi's hand and took a step toward Briggs, her finger pointing straight at his heart. You are the liar. You want a war. You started it. You burned the supply wagon. Your men did it. You want this land. You want the railroad. And you do not care who you have to kill to get it. He is not the monster. You are." Briggs was laughing, a high, strained, ugly sound. "The girl is insane. The heathens have broken her mind. She is a liar, a traitor, just like her father. Sergeant, bring the prisoner out. Let us hear the real truth. The one he signed." 2 soldiers, who had been guarding the stockade, dragged a broken figure into the square. Clara gasped. "Father!" It was Eli Hayes, but he was a ruin. His face was a mass of purple and yellow bruises, his left eye swollen, completely shut. He was so thin, he looked like a scarecrow in his own tattered clothes. He looked up, saw Clara, and his one good eye widened in sheer, agonizing disbelief. "Clara, my God, you are alive!" "Eli," Briggs commanded, shoving the signed paper in his face. Tell them what you confessed to tell them, how this savage threatened you, how he demanded your daughter, how he burned the wagon." Eli Hayes looked at the paper. He looked at the face of his tormentor, Colonel Briggs. He looked at the hard, hateful faces of his neighbors. And then he looked at his daughter. He saw her, not as the pale, dutiful child he had sold, but as a fierce, strong woman, standing tall, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her dress stained with another's blood. He saw that she was magnificent, and the last, poisoned, cowardly piece of his soul broke. "No," he whispered. "What did you say, you drunken filth?" Briggs hissed, grabbing his shirt. "No," Eli said, his voice rising, a terrible, sobbing wail. She is telling the truth. She is telling the truth." The town went dead silent. He did not threaten me." Eli wept, falling to his knees in the dust. "Taji Nez, he asked for peace. He only asked for peace." He looked at Clara, his face a mask of self-loathing. "I did it. I sold you. I sold my own child. To save my land. To pay my debt. God forgive me. Clara, I sold you." He turned his one good eye, full of a new, desperate courage, on Briggs. "And him, that animal, he tortured me. He kept me in the dark. He starved me. He made me sign it. He made me sign the lie. He burned the wagon. It was him. It was always him." The entire crowd, as one body, turned and looked at Colonel Briggs. Briggs' face was no longer triumphant. It was a mottled purple mask of pure, murderous rage. His plan, his railroad, his career, all of it, undone by a broken-down drunk and a hysterical girl. "Traitors!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "You are all traitors. I am the law, and this is the fate of traitors." He ripped the heavy pistol from his holster. He did not aim at Eli. He aimed at the true cause of his ruin. He aimed at Taji, who was still on the horse, weak but watching, his hand on his knife. At that exact moment, Jetty Miller, the blacksmith's son, the boy Taji had returned, broke free from his mother. Drawn by the shouting, he ran out into the open square, curious, right into the line of fire between Briggs and the red horse. "Jetty misses!" Miller screamed. Briggs did not see him, or he did not care. His eyes were fixed on Taji. His finger was tightening on the trigger. Taji saw the boy. With his one good arm, he yanked the reins, trying to turn the horse, trying to shield Clara, but Clara had already moved. She did not hide. She did not duck. She lunged, spinning, and threw herself. Not in front of Taji, but in front of the gun. She stood between Briggs and everyone. Taji, the boy, the town, her arms thrown wide. "No!" she screamed. A human shield. Briggs's face was contorted. He was going to fire. He was going to shoot right through her. A different shot cracked the air. Louder, deeper. A rifle, not a pistol. It came from the porch of the blacksmith shop. Colonel Briggs froze. He looked down, his expression one of pure, blank confusion. A dark, wet circle was spreading on the front of his crisp blue coat. He looked up at the crowd, his mouth open. He pitched forward and fell, face first, into the red dust, and did not move again. The crowd parted. Mr. Miller, the blacksmith, stood on his porch, his long hunting rifle still smoking in his hands. His wife was sobbing, clutching Jetty to her chest. Miller looked at the silent soldiers, his face pale but resolute. He was going to shoot the girl. He did not even see my boy. He would have shot my boy. The standoff was broken. The soldiers looked at their dead commander. They looked at the townsman with the rifle. They looked at the wounded Apache and the white woman who was guarding him. They slowly, one by one, lowered their guns. Clara was still standing, her arms outstretched, trembling so violently she could barely stand. Taji slid from the horse, his legs buckling. He fell against her, and she caught him, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding him upright. She turned, still supporting his weight, to face the silent, stunned, and shame-faced town. She looked at her father, who was still on his knees, weeping. She looked at Mrs. Miller, who was staring at her with a look of dawning, horrified awe. She looked at Carter, who was the only one who had not moved, his expression one of cool, dispassionate calculation. "I am not," Clara said, her voice clear, hard, and carrying in the new, vast silence. "I am not a debt. I am not a sacrifice." She looked down at the man who was leaning on her, his head resting against her shoulder, his pained breathing hot on her neck. She tightened her grip, pulling him closer. "I was given to this man," she said, meeting the eyes of every person in that square. "But I choose to stay with him. I love him. I do not care what you call him. I do not care what you call me." She took a step, Tajai leaning on her, his feet dragging in the dust. "He needs a doctor." She did not look back. She did not ask for permission. She began to walk, one painful, determined step at a time, toward the small doctor's office at the far end of the street. And the crowd, the mob, the men who had come to kill, parted for her. Silent, shamed, and in awe, they watched her go. The doctor's office was a small, hot room that smelled of carbolic acid and stale blood. Dr. Hayes' no relation. A fact he'd pointed out with some relief for years was an old man with shaking hands and kind, tired eyes. He worked on Taji's shoulder by the light of 2 kerosene lamps, pulling out fragments of cloth and shattered bone. Taji lay on the examination table, his skin gray with pain. He had refused the whiskey the doctor offered, his jaw set, his eyes closed. Clara stood beside him, her hand gripping his good one, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a damp cloth. She never flinched. She watched the entire, gruesome procedure with a cold, focused calm. Outside, the town of Dust Creek was in a state of shock. The body of Colonel Briggs had been dragged unceremoniously into his office and left there. The soldiers, leaderless and confused, had retreated to their small barracks. Awaiting orders, the deputized mob had simply dissolved, men slipping away to their homes or back to the saloon, their rifles suddenly heavy and useless. They had been ready to follow a man to a massacre, and a blacksmith had shot him dead to save a child. The moral certainty of the world had cracked wide open. Mr. Miller, the blacksmith, sat on the bench outside the doctor's office, his rifle across his knees, saying nothing. He just sat. He was, Clara realized, guarding them. For 2 days, a fragile, stunned truce held. Clara stayed in the small room, sleeping in a chair by Tazi's side. Mrs. Miller brought them broth and bread. She would not look at Taji, but she would put her hand on Clara's arm and squeeze, her eyes full of a new, complex emotion, awe, fear, and a deep, maternal pity that was no longer condescending. On the 3rd day, the army returned. It was not a column of vengeful soldiers. It was a small, professional detachment of 10 cavalrymen, led by a man who was nothing like Briggs. His name was Captain Wallace. He was young, his uniform immaculate, his eyes intelligent and weary. He was not a conqueror. He was a civil servant. He did not come to the doctor's office. He sent a soldier with a polite, written request for a meeting. He met Taji, who was now sitting up, his arm bound tightly, his face pale but his dignity intact. In the neutral space of the town hall, Clara was at his side. The shaman and 2 Apache elders, who had ridden in under a white flag, were there. Banker Carter was there, representing the town's business. Mr. Miller was there, representing the people. Captain Wallace laid his hat on the table. "Gentlemen, Miss Hayes, I am not Colonel Briggs. I am here to clean up his mess. And to be perfectly clear, my orders are not to start a war. My orders are to see the railroad survey completed." He looked at Taji. "The federal government wants that pass. The railroad is a matter of national priority. It will be built. That is not negotiable." The shaman began to speak, his voice rising. But Taji held up his good hand, and, Captain Wallace said, "Colonel Briggs' actions were unauthorized, brutal, and a disgrace. His death, while unfortunate, has been ruled a justifiable act of civilian defense." He nodded toward Mr. Miller. "The army has no quarrel with you, sir, or with this town." He turned back to Tazi. "But the valley, the one Briggs wanted, it is the route. You cannot stay there. It is now the property of the United States government." The air was thick. The elders looked at the floor. They had lost. "But," Wallace continued, "in light of your people's restraint and the clear provocations, the territory is willing to make a concession. We will deed you, in the name of the government, the full rights to the Northern Valley, the one you call Eagle's Rest. It is more remote. It is rougher, but it is yours. It will be reservation land, protected by federal treaty. You will be moved there, under Army protection, to ensure you are safe from civilian reprisal." It was an execution, delivered politely. They were being evicted. They were losing their ancestral home, but they were being given a new one. And, crucially, they were being given life. Taji sat in silence for a full minute. He was a warrior, but he was also a leader. He knew a fight meant annihilation. He looked at the shaman. The old man's eyes were closed. "We accept," Taji said, the words tasting like ash. "We will need 3 days to gather our people, to prepare our dead." "You have them," Captain Wallace said. He stood and put on his hat, a man who had just finished a difficult piece of business. The town of Dust Creek breathed a collective, complicated sigh. The war was not coming. The Apache were leaving, but the story was not so simple anymore. The town was split. One half, the louder half, still met in the thirsty devil. They grumbled that Briggs was a hero and Miller was a murderer, and that the Apache's woman had brought a curse on them all. But their voices were hollow. They no longer had the Army's backing. They were just bitter men, their power gone. The other half, the quieter half, was centered around the blacksmith's forge and the general store. They spoke in low tones of Eli's confession, of Briggs's madness, of the impossible bravery of the girl they had all condemned. They looked at Mr. Miller with respect. They looked at Clara with a profound, uncertain awe. The day before the Apache were to leave, a small delegation of women came to the doctor's office. It was Mrs. Miller, the shopkeeper's wife, and 2 other women who had once been Clara's mother's friends. Clara met them on the porch. She was wearing a simple cotton skirt and shirt Mrs. Miller had brought her, her hair clean and braided down her back. The women were nervous. They held small gifts, a tin of tea, a jar of peaches. "Clara, child," Mrs. Miller began, her hands twisting in her apron. We came to see how you were." "I am well, thank you," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, polite, but it held a new, cool distance. She was not their Clara anymore. "We are so sorry, child," the shopkeeper's wife burst out, her eyes filling with tears. "For what your father, for what that savage," the third woman whispered, her eyes darting to the closed door of the office, where Tazi was resting. She leaned in, her voice dropping. "Clara, dear, did he hurt you in that way?" It was the question, the one true, terrible question that lay at the heart of all their prejudices. Clara looked at the 3 women. She saw their fear, their morbid curiosity, their desperate need to believe she was a ruined victim, a sacrifice to a monster. It would have been so easy to lie, so easy to say yes and be welcomed back. A lost, tragic lamb. She smiled. It was a small, sad smile, an adult smile that they did not recognize. "Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice soft. "He never laid a hand on me in anger. He never touched me at all, not until the night I came to him, not until I kissed him first." The 3 women gasped. Their faces were a picture of profound, shattered shock. This was not a story of rape. This was a story of choice, of love. Mrs. Miller's eyes went wide, and then she, too, smiled. A slow, dawning comprehension. "Oh, child," she whispered, her hand going to her heart. "Oh, my—" She understood. The other 2 were still scandalized, but the seed was planted. Clara was not a victim. She was a woman. Later that day, her father came. He had been staying at the miller's house, sober, clean, and utterly broken. He stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, his face a ruin of guilt. "Clara," he whispered. He could not look at her. "Father, I cannot ask you to forgive me," he stammered, the tears rolling down his bruised cheeks. "What I did, it was the act of a monster. I sold you. I sold my own soul. And then I signed that paper." She waited. "I am," he finished, his voice a dry croak. "So very, very sorry. For all of it. For your mother. For the ranch. For you." Clara looked at the man who had been her world. She saw his weakness, his cowardice, his terrible, human frailty. And she felt not the hot rage of betrayal, but a vast, aching sadness. She stepped forward and put her arms around him. He flinched, as if expecting a blow, and then he collapsed against her, sobbing, his body shaking with the force of his guilt. "I forgive you, Father," she whispered into his thin hair. "I forgive you." "I will make it right," he wept. "I will. Stay here. Clara, we can start again. The ranch. Carter cannot take it now. Not after. The Millers, they will help." She held him for a moment longer, then gently pushed him back, holding him at arm's length. She looked into his one good eye. "I forgive you," she said again. "But I cannot stay. But why, this is your home. I am your father." "I love you, Father," she said, and her voice was kind, but it was not the voice of his daughter. It was the voice of a woman he did not know. "But my home is not here, my place. It is not here anymore. You must see that. I am not the girl who left." He looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, the calm in her face. He saw the truth. He had not just sold her. He had set her free. He had broken the chain, and she could never be tied again. He nodded, his tears silent now. "I know," he whispered. "I know." The next morning, she rode out to the valley. The Apache were leaving. She found them in the central clearing, packing their lives onto horses and travois. The lodges were being dismantled. The place that had been a vibrant, hidden home was becoming a ghost. The mood was not one of war, but of a vast, communal funeral. They were leaving the bones of their ancestors. She found Nayland by the creek, bundling dried herbs. The two women looked at each other. Nayland's eyes were red from weeping, but her face was hard. "You came," Nayland said. "I came." "He is a fool," Nayland said. "This Captain Wallace, this new valley. It is hard. The winters are cold. The hunting is thin. He does not protect us. He is exiling us." "I know," Clara said. "But we will live," Nayland said, her chin lifting. "We will always live." She looked at Clara, and her hard gaze softened. "And you, pale rabbit, you fought." "I fought," Clara agreed. Nayland reached into a pouch at her belt. She pulled out a small, simple bracelet made of blue and white beads. "My mother made this." She grabbed Clara's wrist and tied it on. "For the sister I did not ask for." Clara felt her own eyes sting. She reached up to the small shell button on her own shirt, one her mother had sewn. She fumbled with it, pulled it free, and pressed it into Nayland's hand. It is all I have. From my mother." Nayland closed her fist around the small, pearlescent button. She nodded. It was done. They were sisters. Taji found her by the creek. He was dressed for travel, his arm still in the sling. But he stood tall. He looked out over the valley, his valley, for the last time. "They are ready," he said. "I know." He turned to her. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark. "Clara, you do not have to come." She stilled. This is not your fight, not anymore. The town, they are afraid of you. They respect you. That man, Miller, your father, you would be safe here. They would not harm you. You could have a life, a white life. He was giving her a choice. The one, true, final choice. This new place, he continued, his voice low. It will be hard, as Nolan says, cold. We will be poor. We will be hated by the prospectors. There will be no peace, only a different kind of war. A war of surviving. He looked at her, his gaze holding all the pain of his people and all of his love for her. I do not ask you to come. I have no right to ask you for anything. Clara looked past him, back down the trail that led to Dust Creek. She saw the town. She saw the church spire, the false front of the saloon, the windows of the general store. She saw the faces of the women, whispering her name, their eyes wide with scandal and pity. She saw her father, a broken man living on the charity of his neighbors. She knew, with a certainty that went to her bones, that if she stayed, she would never be Clara Hayes. She would be a story, a living, breathing piece of gossip. The girl who was sold to the Apache, the one who, lived with them. Her purity, which they had been so eager to sell, would be the only thing they ever spoke of. She would be a ghost, trapped in her own past. She turned her back on the town and looked at the man in front of her. She looked at his wounded shoulder. She looked at his proud, tired, beautiful face. She saw the hard, cold, dangerous future he was offering. A life of struggle, of poverty, of being an outcast. It was the only life she wanted. It was freedom. You have no right to ask me, she said, her voice soft. So I will choose. She stepped forward and put her hand on his chest, over his heart. My place is with you, Taji Nez. Wherever you go, that is my home. He searched her eyes, looking for any sign of doubt, of martyrdom. He found none. He saw only strength. He saw his wife. His good arm came up and wrapped around her, pulling her close. He buried his face in her hair. He did not speak. He did not need to. She chose. She mounted her spotted mare, Tazi, wincing, mounted his red horse. They rode out of the valley, Nolan beside her. The shaman and the elders in front, the rest of the people, a long, sad, proud column, following. When they passed the edge of Dust Creek, the town was there to watch. They stood on the porches, in the street. Her father, his head high, watching his daughter go. Mrs. Miller, weeping, one hand raised in farewell. Mr. Miller, who nodded once, a gesture of respect. Banker Carter, who simply watched the assets leave. Clara did not look at them. She looked forward, at the tall, broad back of the man she loved. She rode past the last house, past the last fence post, and out into the vast, open, unknown wilderness. She had chosen her future. She did not look back. The high desert winter was a clean, sharp blade. It cut the world down to essentials stone, ice, wind, and sky. The new valley, Eagle's Rest, was not the gentle, hidden sanctuary the old one had been. It was higher, the soil thinner, the creek a faster, colder rush from the snowpack. Nayland had been right. It was a hard land. But 1 year on, it was a hard land that was becoming a home. They had survived. The first winter had been brutal, a long, lean fight against starvation. But they had endured. They had dug their wiki-ups into the south-facing slopes, using the earth itself for warmth. They had hunted, and they had learned the new rhythms of this new land. Clara, now 21, had become a different woman. The sun and wind had deepened her tan, and her hands were permanently calloused, no longer the raw, chapped hands of the ranch, but the strong, competent hands of a survivor. She moved with the easy, ground-covering grace of the Apache women. She wore buckskin, not out of necessity, but out of choice. She sat on a flat rock in the afternoon sun, a small circle of children at her feet. They were Apache children, their black eyes bright and curious. She held a piece of charcoal and a smooth, pale piece of bark. This, she said, drawing a shape, is B. It makes the ba sound, like Bear. She drew a clumsy picture of a bear. A small boy laughed. No, that is shush. Bear is shush, he made the guttural sound, correcting her. You are right, Clara laughed, tapping his nose. In your tongue, he is shush. In my tongue, he is bear. She pointed to the letter. B, bear. The children dutifully repeated the sound, bear. In return, they taught her. She had learned to say ithkan for bread, tu for water, and shema for mother. She had learned the stories of the coyote and the creation, of the giver of life. She had learned which roots to dig for medicine, and which to avoid. The children, running and laughing between two worlds, were the first true bridge. They were the future. That bridge, impossibly, had begun to stretch back to Dust Creek. 2 months ago, a lone rider had approached the new valley. It was not a soldier. It was Mr. Miller, the blacksmith. He had led a mule packed with sacks. Tazi had met him at the boundary, his hand on his knife. Mr. Nez, Miller had said, his voice gruff, his eyes respectful. I brought seed, he pointed to the sacks. Corn, beans, and metal, he pointed to another pack. Bar iron, for tools, for you, a gift. Tazi had only stared at him. My boy, Jetty. Miller's voice had thickened. You brought him back, and, at the end, your wife, she saved him. Again, I am in your debt. It was not a trade. It was a repayment. Now, others came. Not many, but a few. A farmer whose homestead bordered the new reservation land, who had lost a cow and Tazi's scouts had found it for him. He brought flour. Mrs. Miller sent bolts of cloth and, once, a small bag of peppermint candy for Clara. A slow, fragile commerce, built not on profit, but on a shared, hard-won respect. Clara, too, had brought her own knowledge. She worked alongside Nolan in the new fields. The way your mother taught you is good, Clara said, as they planted corn. But my mother, she taught me this. She showed Naylan how to plant the beans and the squash among the corn, the way she had read in a farmer's almanac. The beans, they put the food back in the soil that the corn takes out, and the squash, its big leaves keep the sun off the ground and hold the water in. Naylan had been skeptical. One plant, one hole, that is the way. But they had tried it, and now their harvest was, impossibly, richer than it had been in the old valley. It was not civilizing. It was sharing. It was survival. That night, a cool, clear autumn evening, the village was alive. A good hunt, a full harvest. The drums were beating, a sound of celebration, not war. Clara sat by the fire outside their lodge. It was a real lodge now, one of the largest, built with her own hands helping. She was roasting corn, the sweet, smoky smell filling the air. Tazi sat across from her. His shoulder had healed. A thick, ropey scar, livid and permanent, covered his left shoulder and chest. A map of the day she had thought she would lose him. He was no longer the ghost rider. He was a leader, a husband, a man at peace, though his eyes never lost their watchful edge. They sat in a comfortable silence. 1 year, Clara said quietly, looking into the flames. It was 1 year ago this week. 1 year, he agreed. The day in the square. She shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. I was so afraid. I thought you were a monster. I thought you would. I know, he said. She looked at him. They all looked at me, Mrs. Miller, all of them, whispering. At 20, she was given, still untouched. She said the words, and they felt like an old, painless bruise. I was 20, she said, her voice full of a soft, wondrous clarity. A girl, a thing, a payment. Tazi looked at her, his dark eyes soft in the firelight. He saw the woman across from him, her face full of life and strength, her hands competent, her eyes clear. He saw the blue and white beads of his sister's bracelet on her wrist. You are 21 now, he said, his voice low. "Yes," she said. She reached across the fire and put her hand on his knee. "And I am not untouched. I am loved. And I am not given. I am a woman who chose." He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers, and lifted it. He pressed her knuckles to his lips, a gesture of such profound, quiet reverence it made her heart ache. "You are," he said, his voice rough, "Shikala, my wife." After they had eaten, he stood and pulled her to her feet. "Come." "Where?" "The high place." He led her up the familiar path, the one that climbed the cliffs behind the village. His step was sure, his wounded shoulder no longer impeding his strength. They came out on a high, flat promontory, the Eagle's Rest that gave the valley its name. The entire world was spread out below them. The moon was a silver crescent, and the sky was a black velvet cloth, punched through with 1,000,000 diamond-bright stars. Below, their new village was a scattering of warm, golden lights. The sound of the drums, of laughter, of Nalin singing an old song drifted up to them on the clear, cold air. Taji put his good arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was a solid, warm wall behind her. This is a hard land," he said, his voice a low rumble against her hair. "It is not the home of my grandfathers. The winter is long." "But we are here," she whispered, leaning her head back against his good shoulder. "We are here," he agreed. He pointed with his chin down toward the lights, the fires, the small, struggling, living village. "This is my home now. Clara, this is the home of my people." He paused, his arm tightening around her. If you want it, it is your home too." Clara smiled. She remembered the girl in the blue calico dress, sold for a patch of dry, dying land. She thought of her father, who was, in his last letter, working for Mr. Miller at the forge, sober and finding his own hard peace. She thought of the people in Dust Creek, still trapped, in their own way, by the smallness of their lives. She understood, standing there under that vast, cold sky, that freedom was not a gift. It was not a place. It was a choice. A hard, painful, terrifying choice. And you had to make it every single day. "It is already my home," she whispered. She turned in his embrace, her hands sliding up his chest, and kissed him. They walked down the hill, hand in hand, back into the warmth, back into the light. The drums were louder now, a steady, joyful heartbeat. The children were chasing a dog around the central fire. The women were talking, their voices rising and falling in easy, comfortable cadence. Nalin saw them and raised a hand in greeting. It was not a den of devils. It was not an enemy camp. It was a community. It was flawed, and it was struggling, and it was alive, and it was theirs. As they reached the edge of the light, Clara stopped. She turned, looking back, not at the village, but at the far distance, at the jagged black line of the mountains they had left behind. And she heard it. It was impossibly faint, a high, thin wail, carried for miles on the cold night wind, a sound of steam and steel. The train, the railroad was finished. It was running through the old valley, through their ghosts, the sound of the new world. Taji heard it too. He stood beside her, his face unreadable as he listened to the cry of the iron horse that had taken his home. Clara held her breath, a sudden, cold sadness touching her. The world was so large, so powerful. And then, the drummer in the village, as if in answer, struck the drum. A deep, resonant boom, boom, boom that rolled up the canyon, a heartbeat of leather and wood. The train whistle was the sound of what was coming. The drum was the sound of what endured. The two sounds met in the vast, dark wilderness of the Wild West. And the drum, defiant, joyful, and alive, was not drowned out. It held its own. Clara took Tazi's hand. She looked at her husband, at the man who had chosen her, and she led him home, into the light. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would be absolutely honored if you would leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you are listening from. We love connecting with our audience. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, for more stories like this one. And if you enjoyed this journey, please give the video a like and press that hype button. It truly helps us share these tales with more people, and we would be so grateful for your support.